Hey guys, have you ever wondered if the history we know is the whole truth? Sometimes, the most dangerous secrets are hidden in the margins of a diary. In this story, we follow Eleanor Vance, a woman who discovers that her father's death was not an accident, but a message. This is a tale of betrayal, courage, and a mystery that burns brighter than fire. The fog in Boston did not merely obscure the city, it seemed to consume it. It rolled off the Atlantic in thick, gray waves, swallowing the gaslights that lined Beacon Hill and muffling the rhythmic clatter of carriage wheels on the cobblestones. For Eleanor Vance, the weather was a fitting companion to her mood. Eleanor stood by the tall, arched window of the Boston Athenaeum, her reflection ghostly against the glass. At 26, she felt much like the rare manuscripts she spent her days restoring, dusty, overlooked, and bound by histories she had no part in writing. She adjusted the high collar of her blouse, her fingers stained with ink and the residue of binding glue. The library was closing. The other archivists, men with gray beards and grave expressions, had already donned their coats, eager to return to warm hearths and waiting families. Eleanor had neither. "Miss Vance," a voice croaked from the shadows of the stacks. Eleanor turned to see Mr. Abernathy, the head librarian, peering over his spectacles. "The library is closing, unless you intend to haunt the biography section for another night." "Just finished the cataloging for the Winthrop estate, Mr. Abernathy," Eleanor replied, forcing a polite smile. "I wouldn't want to leave the ledger open." "Diligence is a virtue, but so is punctuality," the old man muttered, extinguishing a nearby lamp. "Go home, girl. The fog is turning into a soup out there." Eleanor nodded, gathered her belongings, and stepped out into the biting chill. The walk to her boarding house on Charles Street was short, but tonight, the city felt different. The shadows stretched longer than usual, and the silence of the streets felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken threats. Her life in Boston was simple, bordering on austere. Since the death of her father, Samuel Vance, 3 years ago, she had lived a quiet existence. Samuel had been a man of many secrets and few words, a cartographer who spent more time with maps than with his daughter. He had left her very little money, a surplus of debt, and a lingering sense that she never truly knew him. When she arrived at the boarding house, the landlady, Mrs. Higgins, was waiting in the hallway. Mrs. Higgins was a woman of ample proportions and an even more ample curiosity. She held a silver tray, upon which sat a single, peculiar object. "You're late, Eleanor," Mrs. Higgins said, her eyes darting to the object on the tray. "And you have mail. Or rather, a package. It was hand-delivered. By a man I've never seen before." Eleanor frowned, removing her gloves. "A man? Did he leave a name?" "No name. Just said it was urgent. He looked foreign. Sharp features. Didn't blink enough for my liking." Eleanor reached out and took the envelope. It was heavy, made of thick, vellum parchment that felt rough against her skin. There were no stamps, only her name written in a jagged, aggressive script, "Miss Eleanor Vance." But it was the wax seal that made her breath hitch in her throat. It was not a standard seal. It was an intricate design of a serpent coiling around a broken sword, the same symbol that was etched into the signet ring her father had worn every day of his life. A ring that had vanished the night he died. "Thank you, Mrs. Higgins," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly. She grabbed the envelope and hurried up the narrow staircase to her room, ignoring the landlady's inquisitive stare. Her room was small, lit only by a single kerosene lamp and the dying embers of a fire in the small grate. She locked the door, a habit she had developed recently without knowing why, and sat at her small writing desk. She stared at the envelope for a long time. The paper smelled of salt water and something metallic, like dried blood or rusted iron. With a letter opener, she broke the seal. The wax cracked with a sharp snap. Inside, there was no money, no deed to a property, and no heartfelt confession. There were only 2 items, a letter written on yellowed paper and a heavy, iron key with a triangular head. Eleanor unfolded the letter. The handwriting was not her father's. It was elegant, antiquated, the kind of script one saw in documents from the previous century. "To the blood of the navigator. If you are reading this, then the silence has finally been broken. The oath of 1812, sworn in shadows and kept in blood, is unraveling. Your father, Samuel, tried to outrun the legacy, but the horizon always catches up to the ship. He did not die of heart failure, Miss Vance. He was silenced. You believe your life is your own, but you are merely a custodian of a secret that could burn this nation to its very foundations. The key enclosed opens the safe deposit box at the Mercantile Bank in Philadelphia, Box 404. Inside, you will find the truth about what lies beneath the foundation of the old Blackwood Manor. Do not trust the police. Do not trust the historians. And above all, beware the man with the silver cane. He knows you have the key. Go to Philadelphia. Finish what Samuel could not. A friend of the oath. Eleanor dropped the letter as if it were burning. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Murdered? The official report had been clear. A heart attack in his study. She had found him herself, slumped over his maps. She looked at the iron key. It was cold, heavy, and pitted with rust. This is madness, she whispered to the empty room. She stood up to pace, her mind racing. Samuel Vance had been a boring man. He drew coastlines. He corrected boundaries for state surveys. He was not a man involved in oaths or blood. And yet, the signet ring, she couldn't deny the symbol on the wax. Suddenly, a sound from the street below shattered her concentration. It was a distinct, metallic tap-tap-tap against the cobblestones. Slow, deliberate. Eleanor froze. She moved silently to the window, careful not to disturb the curtains. Peering through the narrow slit, she looked down onto Charles Street. The fog was thick, swirling around the gaslight post directly across from her building. Standing there, illuminated by the flickering yellow light, was a figure. He wore a long, dark overcoat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. But the light caught something in his hand. It was a cane with a handle that gleamed polished silver in the mist. The man was not moving. He was staring directly up at her window. A chill that had nothing to do with the Boston winters swept through Eleanor's body. The letter wasn't just a message, it was a warning, and the warning had arrived too late. The friend of the oath had said beware. The man below raised the cane slightly, tipping it toward her window in a mock salute. Then, he turned and dissolved into the fog, the tap-tap-tap fading into the night. Eleanor backed away from the window, her hands shaking. She looked at the frail lock on her door. It seemed laughably inadequate now. She grabbed her travel bag from under the bed. Her hands moved on autopilot, packing essentials. A change of clothes, her father's journal, a small dagger she used for cutting book bindings, and the little money she had saved in a tin box. She didn't know who sent the letter. She didn't know what was in Philadelphia. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The life of Eleanor Vance, the quiet archivist, was over. She sat on the edge of her bed, the iron key clutched in her hand so tightly it cut into her palm. She remembered a night from her childhood, a storm raging outside, her father looking at a map of the original 13 colonies with a look of profound sorrow. History is not what is written, Ellie, he had told her, his voice low. History is what is hidden. She hadn't understood him then. She looked at the letter again. He did not die of heart failure. Anger, hot and sudden, replaced her fear. If they had killed him, if her boring, quiet father had died for a secret, she would find out why. She would go to Philadelphia. She would open Box 404. Eleanor blew out the kerosene lamp, plunging the room into darkness. She would not sleep tonight. She would wait for the first light of dawn, and then she would catch the first train south. Outside, the wind howled through the streets of Boston, sounding less like the weather and more like the whispers of ghosts waking up after a long, long sleep. The game had begun, and Eleanor held the first piece. She slipped the key into her locket, feeling its cold weight against her skin. "For you, Papa," she whispered into the dark. "I will find them." The grandfather clock in the hallway of Mrs. Higgins' boarding house struck 4 times. The sound reverberated through the silent house like a judge's gavel, heavy and final. Inside her room, Eleanor Vance was already awake. In truth, she hadn't slept at all. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, fully dressed in her travel suit, a sturdy charcoal wool ensemble that she usually reserved for funerals. It felt appropriate. She was leaving behind the only life she had known, mourning the illusion of safety she had lived under for the past 3 years. The room was stripped bare of her presence. The few personal trinkets she owned were packed into the leather satchel at her feet. On the desk, she left a week's rent in an envelope for Mrs. Higgins, along with a brief, vague note about a family emergency in New Hampshire. It was a lie, but the truth was too dangerous to share. Eleanor moved to the window one last time. The fog from the previous night had thinned but not vanished. It clung to the cobblestones of Charles Street like a bruised memory. She pressed her face against the cold glass, scanning the street below. The gas light flickered. The spot where the man with the silver cane had stood was empty. But emptiness was not reassurance. She picked up her satchel. It was heavy, weighed down by her father's journals and the few clothes she possessed. She touched her chest, feeling the cold iron outline of the key hidden beneath her blouse, resting against her skin. It was her anchor now. Opening her door, she winced as the hinges gave a soft groan. She paused, holding her breath. The house remained silent, save for the rhythmic snoring of Mr. O'Malley in the room across the hall. Eleanor crept down the stairs, placing her feet on the edges of the steps where the wood was less likely to creak. The front door was the final hurdle. It was a heavy oak beast that tended to stick in the damp weather. Eleanor gripped the brass handle with both hands, turning the lock slowly. She pulled. The door yielded with a sigh, and the biting morning air rushed in to meet her. She stepped out onto the stoop and closed the door behind her. She was out. The city of Boston was waking up, but it was a groggy, surly awakening. A milk wagon rattled in the distance, the horse's hooves clattering sharply against the stone. Eleanor didn't wait. She turned her collar up against the wind and began to walk briskly toward the main avenue to hail a cab. She didn't run. Running attracted attention, but she walked with a purpose that brooked no interruption. Every shadow that stretched from the alleyways seemed to morph into a figure with a cane. Every rustle of dry leaves sounded like footsteps behind her. Paranoia, she told herself. Or survival. She found a hansom cab near the common. The driver, a man with a face like a crumpled map, looked down at her skeptically. "South Station," Eleanor said, handing him a coin before he could ask. "And there is an extra $1 in it if we make the first train." The driver grunted, bit the coin, and snapped his reins. The cab lurched forward. As they rattled through the streets, Eleanor dared to look back through the small rear window of the cab. Behind them, the street was empty. But just as the cab turned a corner, she saw a black carriage pull out from a side street. It was too far away to see the driver, but it matched the pace of her cab perfectly. Eleanor's grip on her bag tightened until her knuckles turned white. He knows. South Station was a cavern of steel, glass, and steam. It was the beating heart of the industrial Northeast, a place where humanity was funneled through gates and platforms in a chaotic stream of wool coats and bowler hats. The noise was deafening, the shriek of steam whistles, the bellowing of conductors, the roar of engines. For Eleanor, usually sequestered in the hushed reverence of the Athenaeum, it was an assault on the senses. But the chaos was also a shield. In a crowd this dense, it was hard to be followed. She moved quickly toward the ticket counter. "One way to Philadelphia," she said, her voice struggling to rise above the din. The ticket master, a harried man with ink-stained fingers, didn't even look up. "That'll be the 5:15 express. Trevor, boarding now." He slid a ticket across the marble counter. Eleanor snatched it up and turned, scanning the vast concourse. Hundreds of faces. Soldiers returning from posts, businessmen checking pocket watches, families with crying children. Her eyes darted frantically, searching for a wide-brimmed hat or the glint of silver. Near the entrance, standing perfectly still against a pillar while the crowd flowed around him like water around a rock. A man in a dark overcoat. He was reading a newspaper, but he wasn't looking at the words. His eyes were scanning the ticket line. Eleanor didn't wait to see the cane. She spun around, ducking behind a luggage trolley piled high with trunks. Heart-hammering, she weaved through the crowd, using a group of nuns as cover to reach track 4. The train was a monstrous beast of iron and steam, belching smoke into the glass ceiling of the station. The conductor was shouting, "All aboard! Last call for Providence, New Haven, New York, and Philadelphia." Eleanor handed her ticket to the conductor and climbed the steep metal steps. She didn't stop in the first car. She moved through the second and the third, finally finding a seat in the fourth car, halfway down the aisle. She chose a seat facing backward, so she could watch the door she had just entered. She sat down, pressing herself against the cold window. The train jerked, a violent shudder that ran through the floorboards. Then, with a slow, grinding groan, it began to move. The platform outside started to slide away. Faces blurred. The station pillars whipped past. Eleanor watched the platform entrance until the very last second, terrified that the man would burst through the doors and jump onto the moving train. But the doors remained closed. The train gathered speed, leaving the station behind and plunging into the gray morning. Eleanor let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 12 hours. She slumped back against the scratchy velvet seat. "Is this seat taken?" Eleanor jumped, her hand instinctively going to the small dagger concealed in her bag. Standing in the aisle was a young man, perhaps a few years older than her. He wore a tweed suit that had seen better days and held a battered leather case. He had a kind, open face, with unruly brown hair and tired eyes. "No," Eleanor stammered, removing her hand from her bag. "No, it's not." "Thank you," the man said with a relieved smile. He stowed his case and sat opposite her. "The other cars are packed tight. You'd think half of Boston is fleeing the cold." He extended a hand. "Julian Thorne, traveling journalist, occasionally employable." Eleanor hesitated. The letter had said trust no one, but ignoring him might draw more attention. She shook his hand briefly. Eleanor Vance." "Pleasure, Miss Vance. Heading south." "Yes." "Philadelphia." "Ah, the city of brotherly love," Julian smiled, unfolding a newspaper. "I'm headed there myself, chasing a story about the labor strikes at the shipyards. Dull stuff, but it pays for the coffee." Eleanor nodded politely and turned her gaze to the window. The city was gone now, replaced by the industrial outskirts of Boston, brick factories with smokestacks churning black soot into the sky, row upon row of tenement housing, and then, finally, the open countryside. The train picked up a rhythmic cadence. Clack-clack whoosh, clack-clack whoosh. As the adrenaline faded, exhaustion washed over her. She watched the leafless trees whip by, skeletal fingers scratching against the gray sky. She pulled her father's journal from her bag. It was a small, leather-bound book that she had saved from the police inventory. Most of the pages were filled with mundane details, tide charts, survey coordinates, grocery lists. But she remembered the letter's mention of the oath of 1812. She flipped to the year 1896, the year her father had started acting strange. The year he had stopped smiling. There, in the margins of a page dated October 4th, was a frantic scrawl in pencil. It was barely legible, written as if in a great hurry. "They found the ledger. The architect knows. I must move the key. 404 is the only safe harbor left. God forgive me for what we did in the darker years." Eleanor traced the words with her gloved finger. The architect. Who was the architect? And what darker years? Her father had been a patriot, a man who loved his country. What could he have done that required God's forgiveness? Bad news? Eleanor snapped the book shut. Julian was watching her over the top of his newspaper. His expression was curious, but not malicious. "Just old memories," Eleanor said tightly. "Memories have a way of biting back," Julian said softly. He pointed to the book. "That's an old surveyor's journal, isn't it? My grandfather used to have one. He worked the rail lines in the West." Eleanor looked at him sharply. "You are very observant, Mr. Thorne." "Hazard of the trade, Miss Vance. A journalist has to look at the details others miss." He paused, his eyes lingering on her for a moment too long. "Like how you check the door of the train car every 3 minutes. Or how you're clutching that bag as if it contains the crown jewels." Eleanor went cold. "I am simply a nervous traveler." "Of course," Julian said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "No offense intended. It's a dangerous world. Being cautious is smart. He went back to his paper, but the atmosphere had shifted. Eleanor didn't trust him. Was his presence here a coincidence? Or was he another player in this game? The train entered a tunnel. The car was plunged into sudden, absolute darkness. The gas lamps in the carriage flickered but failed to light immediately. The noise of the wheels echoed loudly off the tunnel walls, a deafening roar. In the pitch black, Eleanor heard movement. The rustle of fabric. Footstep. Someone was moving toward her. She reached into her bag, her fingers closing around the hilt of the small dagger. She held her breath, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would drown out the train. "Miss Vance?" Julian's voice came from the darkness, but it sounded closer than his seat. She didn't answer. She pulled the dagger halfway out. A match flared. The sudden light was blinding. Julian was holding the match, leaning forward to light the overhead gas lamp. He wasn't reaching for her. He was just trying to fix the light. The gas caught with a poof, bathing the cabin in a warm, yellow glow. Julian sat back down, blowing out the match. He looked at her, and his eyes dropped to her hand, which was still deep inside her bag. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the wild look in her eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice serious now. Eleanor slowly released the dagger and withdrew her empty hand. She took a shaky breath. "I don't like the dark." "Few of us do," Julian said. "That's where the monsters live." The train burst out of the tunnel and into the light. But the light had changed. The gray fog of Boston was gone. In the distance, the sun was finally breaking through the clouds, casting long, golden rays across the frozen fields of Connecticut. It was dawn. Eleanor looked at the rising sun. She had survived the night. She had escaped the city. But as she looked at the golden horizon, she realized the letter was right. The horizon was catching up to the ship. She wasn't just running away from Boston. She was running toward something much older and much darker. She looked at Julian Thorne, who was now asleep, or pretending to be, with his hat pulled over his eyes. One step at a time, she thought. First Philadelphia. Then the bank. Then the truth. Eleanor opened the journal again, ignoring her fear. She turned to the very back page. There, sketched in faint ink, was a drawing she had never noticed before. It was a layout of a building. A large estate, and beneath it, a single word was written in her father's hand, Blackwood. The train whistled, a lonely, mournful sound that carried across the empty fields. The journey had truly begun. The Broad Street station was a cathedral of smoke and iron, a testament to the industrial might of Philadelphia. If Boston had been a city of whispered secrets and foggy cobblestones, Philadelphia was a city of shouting machinery and soot-stained brick. It was louder, dirtier, and undeniably more alive. Eleanor stepped onto the platform, her legs unsteady after the long journey. The air here tasted of coal dust and unrefined oil. Around her, the crowd was a churning river of humanity, laborers in rough-spun caps, businessmen in sharp frock coats, and street urchins darting between legs like minnows. Impressive, isn't it? Eleanor turned to see Julian Thorne standing beside her, his battered leather case in hand. He was looking up at the vaulted glass ceiling of the train shed, a genuine admiration in his tired eyes. "It is overwhelming," Eleanor admitted, gripping the handle of her bag tighter. "That's Philadelphia for you," Julian said with a grin. "It doesn't have Boston's manners, but it has a heartbeat. Do you have a place to stay, Miss Vance?" The question was casual, but Eleanor's guard went up instantly. The letter's warning, "Trust no one," echoed in her mind. "I have arrangements, thank you," she lied smoothly. She had no arrangements. She had a list of boarding houses she had memorized from a travel guide years ago, and a hope that they were cheap. Julian studied her for a moment, his smile fading slightly. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a slightly crumpled calling card. "You are a terrible liar, Eleanor," he said softly. "But I admire the caution. Look, I'm staying at the boarding house on Arch Street. It's not the Ritz, but the bedbugs are polite. If you find yourself in trouble, and this city has a way of finding trouble for people, look me up." He pressed the card into her hand. Before she could respond, he tipped his hat and melted into the crowd, disappearing into the smog. Eleanor looked at the card. Julian Thorne, freelance correspondent. No address, just a name. She slipped it into her pocket, annoyed at herself for feeling a pang of loneliness as he left. She was a stranger here, utterly alone. She exited the station onto Broad Street and was immediately assaulted by the noise. Electric trams clanged their bells, horses whinnied in protest against heavy loads, and newsboys shouted headlines about strikes and scandals. Eleanor walked. She needed to get her bearings. The map in her head, drawn from her father's lessons, told her that the Mercantile Bank was in the financial district, near Chestnut Street. But she couldn't go there yet. Not with her travel bag, looking like a lost tourist. She needed a base of operation. She found a room at a modest establishment called the Wandering Gull near the docks. It was a rough neighborhood, smelling of salt and rotting fish, but it was anonymous. The landlady, a woman with a face like dried leather, took Eleanor's money without asking for a name. "Key sticks," the woman grunted, tossing a brass key on the counter. "Don't let in no guests after 10. And if you hear screaming, ignore it unless it sounds like fire." Eleanor took the room. It was small, damp, and the wallpaper was peeling like sunburned skin. But it had a lock. She sat on the lumpy mattress and took out the iron key from around her neck. Box 404. She checked her pocket watch. It was just past noon. The bank would be open. The Mercantile Bank of Philadelphia was a fortress. Built of gray granite with imposing pillars that looked like they could hold up the sky. It sat on Chestnut Street like a judge presiding over the city. Eleanor stood across the street, pretending to examine the display of a millinery shop. Her reflection in the glass looked pale and out of place among the fashionable ladies of Philadelphia. She watched the bank's entrance. Men in expensive suits went in and out. Guards with nightsticks stood by the heavy oak doors. It looked impenetrable. "Just walk in," she told herself. "You have the key. You have the right." But fear paralyzed her. What if the friend of the oath was wrong? What if the box was a trap? What if the man with the silver cane was already inside, waiting for her to turn the key? She needed to be sure. She crossed the street, her heart hammering against her ribs. She climbed the marble steps, feeling the weight of the building pressing down on her. Inside, the bank was a temple of silence and money. The floors were polished marble, and the air smelled of old paper and brass polish. Tellers worked behind high iron cages, counting stacks of greenbacks with hypnotic speed. Eleanor approached a clerk who looked barely older than herself. I would like to access a safe deposit box," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The clerk looked up, his eyes sweeping over her plain clothes and dusty shoes. "Do you have an account with us, madam?" "My father did," Eleanor said, trying to sound authoritative. "Samuel Vance. I have the key." She produced the heavy iron key. The clerk's expression shifted from boredom to surprise. He leaned in, examining the triangular head of the key. "That is an old series. We haven't issued keys like this since the renovation in '85. He looked at her with new suspicion. "I'll need to speak with the manager. Wait here." He hurried away, disappearing behind a heavy mahogany door. Eleanor stood alone at the counter. A minute passed, then two. The silence of the bank began to feel oppressive. She looked around. A security guard near the door was watching her. He whispered something to another guard. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at her skin. The instinct was irrational, but overwhelming. She felt like a mouse that had just walked into a trap. The mahogany door opened. A tall man with a severe, hawk-like face stepped out, followed by the clerk. The manager's eyes locked onto her instantly. "Miss Vance," the manager called out, his voice smooth but carrying an undertone of steel. "Please, come into my office. We have been expecting you." "I am expecting you." The words hit her like a physical blow. The letter had arrived yesterday. She had told no one. How could they be expecting her? Unless the man with the silver cane had called ahead. Eleanor didn't answer. She grabbed the key from the counter. "Miss Vance," the manager shouted, abandoning his composure. "Stop her." The guard at the door took a step forward, reaching for her arm. Eleanor moved on instinct. She threw her heavy satchel at the guard's legs. He stumbled, cursing. Eleanor bolted for the door. "Seize her!" She burst out onto Chestnut Street, the bright afternoon sun blinding her for a second. She didn't look back. She ran, diving into the throng of pedestrians. "Stop the thief!" someone shouted behind her. She wove through the crowd, ignoring the angry shouts of people she shoved aside. She turned down an alleyway, then another, her lungs burning. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away from the gray granite fortress. She emerged near a market, the smell of roasted peanuts and horse manure filling her nose. She slowed to a walk, gasping for air, her chest heaving. She pulled her coat tight around her to hide her trembling hands. They knew her name. They were waiting. The bank was compromised. The safe harbor her father had written about was a lie. Eleanor leaned against a brick wall, fighting back tears of frustration. She was in a strange city, with no allies, no plan, and now, no access to the only clue she had. She needed information. If she couldn't open the box, she needed to know what Blackwood was. The library, she thought. Libraries are safe. Libraries have answers. The Free Library of Philadelphia was less imposing than the bank, but far more welcoming to Eleanor. She spent the next 4 hours in the archives, hiding behind stacks of books, terrified that every footstep was a policeman coming to arrest her. She requested every record she could find on Blackwood Manor and the Oath of 1812. The librarian, a stern woman with a bun so tight it pulled her eyebrows up, brought her a stack of old newspapers and a local history book. "Blackwood Manor burned down 20 years ago," the woman said sniffily. "Bad business. The whole family died. People say it's cursed. Why would you want to read about that?" "Research," Eleanor muttered. She opened the books. The history of Blackwood Manor was grim. Built in 1790 by a wealthy shipping magnate, Elias Blackwood. It was a grand estate on the outskirts of the city. Elias was a patriot, a financier of the War of 1812. But then the tone of the articles changed. 1879. Tragedy at Blackwood. Fire consumes historic estate. The article described a fire of unnatural intensity that destroyed the main house. Elias's grandson, Thomas Blackwood, and his family were all presumed dead. The cause was never determined, but it was a photograph in a Society Gazette from 1878 that made Eleanor's blood run cold. It was a picture of a gala at the manor. Men in tuxedos, women in gowns. In the center of the photo stood Thomas Blackwood, a handsome man with a dark beard. And standing next to him, looking younger but unmistakably the same, was her father, Samuel Vance. They were shaking hands. And on Thomas Blackwood's finger, clear as day even in the grainy photograph, was the ring, the serpent and the broken sword. Eleanor brought the photo closer to the lamp. She scanned the other faces in the crowd. In the background, standing in the shadows of a pillar, was a man looking directly at the camera. He was tall, thin, and held a cane. His face was blurred by the motion or the poor quality of the film, but his posture was rigid, menacing. Eleanor felt a tap on her shoulder. She nearly screamed, spinning around in her chair. It was Julian Thorne. He held a finger to his lips. "You're making a scene, Eleanor." "You followed me," she hissed, backing away. "I did," Julian admitted calmly. "And a good thing, because there are 2 men in long coats waiting outside the front entrance of the library. They're asking for a woman matching your description." Eleanor froze. "The bank?" "News travels fast," Julian said. He looked at the open book on the table, at the photo of the burning manor. "Blackwood? That's a ghost story, Eleanor. Why are you chasing ghosts?" "They aren't ghosts," Eleanor whispered, pointing at the photo. "They are the ones chasing me." Julian looked at the photo, then back at her. His playful demeanor was gone. "If the men outside are who I think they are, you won't make it 2 blocks. They're Pinkertons. Hired muscle. Expensive muscle." "What do I do?" Eleanor asked, hating the tremor in her voice. Julian hesitated. He looked at the library entrance, then at the back exit sign. "You have 2 choices," he said. "You can keep running alone, and they will catch you before sunset. Or..." He sighed, scratching the back of his neck. or you can trust the stranger you met on a train. I know a way out, but once we go, there's no turning back. Eleanor looked at the photo of her father one last time. He looked so proud, so sure of himself. He had secrets, yes, but he had friends too. Maybe she needed one. She looked at Julian. Why help me? You don't even know what this is. I love a good mystery, Julian said with a half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. And I hate bullies. Come on. Eleanor closed the book. She grabbed her bag. For the first time since leaving Boston, she didn't feel entirely alone. She was still a stranger in a strange land, but at least she had a guide. Lead the way, Mr. Thorne, she said. As they slipped out the back door into the darkening alley, the gas lamps of Philadelphia flickered on, illuminating the path to a city that held more darkness than light. The rain in Philadelphia was not like the mist in Boston. It was aggressive, cold, and smelled of sulfur. It lashed against the brick walls of the narrow alleyway where Eleanor Vance and Julian Thorne huddled, catching their breath. They lost us, Julian whispered, peering around the corner. He wiped rain from his face with a sleeve that was already soaked through. The Pinkertons are persistent, but they don't know the back veins of this city like I do. Eleanor shivered, clutching her satchel to her chest. Her boots were ruined, and her heart was still racing from the sprint through the library's service exit. Where are we going? My lodgings, Julian said, checking the street again. It's not a palace, but it has a lock, and right now, anonymity is your best friend. Eleanor hesitated. Trusting a stranger was against every instinct she had, especially one who admitted to following her. But the image of the men in long coats waiting outside the library, men who likely answered to the man with the silver cane, left her with no options. Lead on, she said, her voice stealing. They moved quickly through the labyrinth of Philadelphia's darker streets, avoiding the gaslit avenues. Julian led her to a boarding house on Arch Street that looked as if it were held together by soot and prayer. They climbed 3 flights of creaking stairs to a room at the end of the hall. The room was small, cluttered with stacks of newspapers, half-empty ink bottles, and maps pinned to the walls. It smelled of stale tobacco and old paper, a smell that, oddly, reminded Eleanor of her father's study. Julian locked the door and slid a heavy chair under the handle. He turned to face her, his demeanor shifting from the charming rogue to something sharper. All right, Miss Vance, he said, tossing his wet coat onto the bed. We are safe for the moment. Now, tell me what is really going on. Pinkertons don't hunt down archivists for overdue books. Eleanor stood by the window, keeping the curtains drawn tight. She looked at Julian, at his tired eyes, his frayed cuffs, the intelligence that lurked behind his easy smile. She decided then that partial truth was better than silence. My father was murdered, she said flatly. Julian stopped rummaging for a towel. He looked at her. The surveyor? I thought it was a heart attack. So did I. Until yesterday. Eleanor moved to the small table in the center of the room and placed the heavy iron key and her father's leather-bound journal on the surface. I received a letter. It told me to come here to find a box at the Mercantile Bank. It said my father was silenced because of something called the Oath of 1812. Julian approached the table slowly. He looked at the key, then at the journal. And the bank manager, he knew you were coming. He was waiting for me, Eleanor confirmed, which means the box is likely a trap. Or empty. Julian picked up the key. He held it up to the flickering light of the kerosene lamp. This isn't just a safe deposit key, Eleanor. Look at the shaft. It's too long and the teeth are irregular. This is a master key. Custom made. For what? For a lock that doesn't exist anymore, Julian murmured. He turned his attention to the journal. May I? Eleanor nodded. Julian opened the book, flipping through the pages of tide charts and survey notes. You said you saw a photo of your father with Thomas Blackwood. The Blackwood family died in a fire 20 years ago. If your father was involved with them, he was playing a dangerous game. The Blackwoods were rumored to be unconventional financiers. Unconventional how? Funding wars. Smuggling. Some say they were the bankers for spies during the War of 1812, Julian said, his eyes scanning a page. If there was an oath, it was likely a pact to keep their operations secret. Eleanor frowned. But that was nearly a century ago. Why kill my father now? Because secrets have a way of rotting, not dying, Julian said. He stopped flipping the pages. He had reached the sketch of Blackwood Manor at the back of the book. Eleanor, look at this. She leaned in. The sketch was detailed, showing the sprawling estate as it had stood before the fire. There were notations for the gardens, the stables, and the main hall. But Julian pointed to a series of faint pencil marks in the corner of the page, seemingly random scratches. These aren't scratches, Julian said. They're coordinates. Or a cipher. Eleanor squinted. My father was a cartographer. He thought in grids. She pulled a magnifying glass from her satchel, a tool of her trade, and held it over the marks. Under the glass, the scratches resolved into tiny, precise numbers. 40, 04, 75. 404, Eleanor whispered. The bank box. Maybe, Julian said. Or maybe the bank box was the decoy. The number 404 is the first part. What is 75? Eleanor's mind raced. She looked at the sketch of the manor again. Her father was meticulous. He never drew anything without a scale. She looked at the legend at the bottom of the map. Scale. 1 inch equals 75 feet. It's a distance, Eleanor realized, her pulse quickening. 404 isn't a box number. It's a direction. 40 degrees for minutes. A bearing, Julian finished for her. From where? Eleanor scanned the map. In the center of the estate's garden, there was a drawing of a large fountain with a statue in the middle. The statue was labeled simply, the Weeping Angel. Here, Eleanor pointed. The statue. If you stand at the base of the Weeping Angel and follow a bearing of 40 degrees for 75 feet. Her finger traced the invisible line across the paper. It landed on a structure on the edge of the property, near the treeline. It was labeled, the Ice House. Julian looked at her with a grin that was half impressed, half terrified. An ice house. Deep underground. Thick walls. Perfect for keeping things cold. Or hidden. The letter said to look beneath the foundation, Eleanor said, her voice trembling with excitement. The bank was a test. Or a way to flush out anyone watching. The real secret is at the manor. And the key? Julian asked, tapping the iron object. The ice house door, Eleanor guessed. Suddenly, a heavy thud from the hallway made them both freeze. It was the sound of a boot hitting wood. Then, the low murmur of voices. Julian killed the lamp instantly, plunging the room into darkness. He grabbed Eleanor's arm and pulled her away from the door. They found us, he whispered, his voice barely audible. How did they find us? The card, Eleanor realized with a jolt of horror. I gave the station master your card when I asked for directions earlier. If they questioned him... Damn, Julian swore softly. The doorknob turned. It rattled against the lock. Then, the heavy weight of a shoulder slammed against the wood. The chair wedged under the handle groaned. Window, Julian ordered. He threw open the sash. The rain poured in, soaking them instantly. They were 3 stories up. Below, a fire escape rusted against the brickwork, but it was a good 4-foot jump from the sill. I can't, Eleanor said, looking down at the slick metal in the dark alley. You can, or you can stay and meet the men who killed your father, Julian said grimly. Go! The door splintered with a deafening crack. A hand reached through the gap to remove the chair. Eleanor didn't think. She climbed onto the sill and leaped. She landed hard on the metal grating of the fire escape, the impact jarring her knees. She slipped on the wet iron, nearly tumbling over the railing, but Julian landed beside her a second later, grabbing her coat to steady her. Down. Go down, he hissed. Above them, the door to the room crashed open. A silhouette appeared in the window, a man in a bowler hat holding a revolver. Bang. A shot rang out, sparking against the railing inches from Eleanor's hand. They scrambled down the rickety ladders, sliding more than climbing. They hit the alley floor running, splashing through puddles as another shot echoed in the confined space. They didn't stop running until they were blocks away, deep in the maze of the garment district, where the steam from the factories provided a thick, white cover. Eleanor collapsed against a crate, gasping for air. Her sides stitched with pain, and her hands were scraped and bleeding. Julian was bent over, hands on his knees, wheezing. "Well," he choked out, "that was invigorating." Eleanor looked at him. He was bleeding from a cut on his cheek, likely from the jump. He had risked his life for her. "Why?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Why are you helping me? You could have walked away." Julian straightened up, wiping the rain from his face. He looked at her, and for the first time, the mask of the carefree journalist dropped completely. His eyes were haunted. "Because my grandfather didn't just work on the rail lines, Eleanor," he said quietly. "He worked for the Blackwoods. He was their groundskeeper. And he vanished the night of the fire." Eleanor stared at him, the rain mingling with the sweat on her face. "You're not just chasing a story." "No," Julian said. "I'm chasing the same ghosts you are. I've been looking for the key to the ice house for 5 years." He looked at the satchel she was clutching. "You have the key. I know the grounds. We need each other." Eleanor looked at the man she had met on the train. The coincidence was no coincidence at all. He had likely been watching the bank or the station, waiting for someone like her to appear. But as she looked at his desperate expression, she realized he was telling the truth about his grandfather. They were bound by the same tragedy. "The ice house," Eleanor said, making her decision. "We go tonight." "Tonight?" Julian asked, surprised. "In this storm." "The storm is our cover," Eleanor said, pushing herself off the crate. She felt a new strength rising within her, the resolve of a woman who had nothing left to lose. "They expect us to run. They expect us to hide. They won't expect us to go straight to the heart of the mystery." She looked at the dark skyline to the north, where the ruins of Blackwood Manor lay rotting in the woods. "We finished this," she said. Julian nodded slowly. A slow smile returned to his face, but this time, it was grim. "To the ruins, then. God help us." They turned and walked into the darkness, leaving the city behind, moving toward the shadows of the forgotten oath. The city of Philadelphia did not sleep. It merely changed its breathing. The industrial roar of the day, the clanging trams and shouting hawkers, faded into a sinister rhythmic wheezing. Steam hissed from grates in the cobblestones, and the gaslights sputtered against the relentless, freezing rain. Eleanor Vance leaned against the rough brickwork of a narrow alleyway in the dockside district. Her breath came in short, sharp ragged plumes of white mist. Her charcoal wool coat, once respectable, was now heavy with water and mud, weighing her down like a lead anchor. "Stay back," Julian whispered, pressing himself flat against the wall. He peeked around the corner, his silhouette barely visible against the gray curtain of rain. "Are they still there?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. "2 of them. Standing under the awning of the apothecary," Julian murmured, pulling his head back. "They aren't Pinkertons. They look like dock workers. Hired muscle. The man with the silver cane has cast a wide net." Eleanor gripped the strap of her satchel. The iron key inside felt hot against her side, a burning brand marking her for death. "We can't stay here, Julian. The cold will kill us before they do." "We need a carriage," Julian said, wiping rainwater from his eyes. "Blackwood Manor is 10 miles north, past the city limits. We can't walk it. Not in this storm, and not with half the city looking for a woman with a leather bag." "You said you knew people," Eleanor pressed. "I do. But my people live in places where polite society fears to tread." He looked at her, his expression grim. "We have to go deeper into the alleys. It's the only way to bypass the main roads. But Eleanor, keep your head down. Don't make eye contact. And for the love of God, keep that bag hidden." They moved. The alleys of Philadelphia were a city within a city, a labyrinth of shadows, rotting garbage, and desperate souls. Julian led her through passages so narrow her shoulders brushed the wet bricks on either side. Rats skittered away from their boots, squeaking in protest. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. A drunkard slumped over a crate raised his head as they passed, muttering unintelligible words. A stray dog barked viciously from behind a fence. Eleanor felt exposed, a raw nerve ending walking through a salt mine. They stopped behind a tavern called the Broken Wheel. The smell of stale beer and roasting meat wafted out from a cracked window, mixing with the stench of the alley. "Wait here," Julian commanded softly. "I need to secure transport. The owner owes me a favor." "You're leaving me?" Eleanor whispered, panic rising in her chest. "I can't take you in there. A woman like you in a place like this, you'd be a beacon." He squeezed her shoulder briefly. "I will be 5 minutes. Hide behind those barrels. If anyone comes, use the dagger." Before she could protest, he slipped through the back door of the tavern. Eleanor was alone. She crouched behind a stack of rotting whiskey barrels, pulling her coat tight. The rain drummed a relentless rhythm on the wood. She closed her eyes, trying to summon the image of the library, the smell of old paper, the safety of her former life. But that life was gone, burned away like ash. Voices. Eleanor's eyes snapped open. The voices were coming from the alley entrance, perhaps 20 feet away. She held her breath. 2 men walked into the alley. They were huge, their shoulders blocking out the dim light from the street lamp. One wore a flat cap, the other was bald with a scar running down his neck. They stopped to light cigarettes, shielding the matches from the rain. "Said she's small. Dark hair. Looks like a schoolteacher," the scarred man grunted. His voice was gravel and smoke. "And the payout?" the other asked. $500. Dead or alive. But the boss wants the bag intact. Specifically the book inside. Eleanor's heart stopped. $500. In 1899, that was a fortune. Men would kill their own brothers for that kind of money. "Who's put up the coin?" the man in the cap asked. "Pinkertons don't pay that high." "Not Pinkertons," the scarred man spat, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "It's the Circle. The ones who run the docks now. They say the architect is back in town." The architect. The name from her father's journal. Eleanor pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. It wasn't just a code name, it was a title that commanded fear even among criminals. "Well," the cap man laughed darkly. "If she's in the city, she's trapped. The bridges are watched. The trains are watched. She's a rat in a bucket." They began to walk down the alley. Toward her. Eleanor looked around frantically. There was nowhere to run. If she bolted, they would see her. If she stayed, they would find her. She looked at the back door of the tavern. It was locked from the inside. The footsteps grew louder. Splash. 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 Eleanor reached into her boot and pulled out the small binding dagger. It looked pathetic against the size of these men. Just as the scarred man passed the barrels, he stopped. He sniffed the air. "Perfume," he muttered. "Lavender." He turned his head slowly toward the barrels. Eleanor tightened her grip on the knife, preparing to strike. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the other end of the alley. A glass bottle shattered against the wall. "You louts," a voice bellowed. The 2 men spun around. Standing at the mouth of the alley was Julian. He was swaying slightly, holding another bottle, looking for all the world like a drunkard who had stumbled out of a pub. "Get lost, drunk," the scarred man growled, reaching into his coat. "This is my alley," Julian shouted, slurring his words perfectly. "I sleep here. You 2 uglies get out." He threw the second bottle. It smashed near the men's feet. The scarred man snarled and took a step toward Julian. "I'm going to gut him." "Forget him," the cap man said, grabbing his partner's arm. "We have a job. The girl isn't here. Let's check the wharf." They glared at Julian one last time, then turned and walked back toward the main street, disappearing into the fog. Julian waited a full 10 seconds after they were gone. Then his drunken posture vanished instantly. He sprinted to the barrels. "Eleanor," he hissed. Eleanor emerged, shaking uncontrollably. "They know. They called him the architect. There's a bounty." "I know," Julian said grimly. "I heard the whispers inside too. The whole underworld is buzzing. We have to move now." "Did you get a carriage?" "Better," Julian said. "Come on." He led her not to the street, but further down the alley to a dilapidated stable attached to a glue factory. Inside, the smell was atrocious, but standing there was a black hearse. A hearse? Eleanor asked, staring at the ominous vehicle. It's the only thing nobody stops in this city, Julian said, opening the back doors. The driver owes me. He's taking a body to the family plot north of the city. That's us. Eleanor looked at the dark, velvet-lined interior of the carriage. It was morbid. It was terrifying. And it was brilliant. Get in, Julian urged. Eleanor climbed in. Julian followed, pulling the door shut. Complete darkness enveloped them. The carriage smelled of formaldehyde and lilies. This is madness, Eleanor whispered in the dark. This is survival, Julian's voice came from beside her. The carriage lurched forward, the wheels grinding against the stones. They moved slowly. Eleanor could hear the sounds of the city muffled through the wooden walls. They heard the shouts of policemen, the clatter of other carriages, and the whistle of the trains they couldn't take. For an hour, they lay there in silence, the tension thick enough to choke on. Every time the hearse stopped, Eleanor's hand went to her dagger. Finally, the rhythm of the wheels changed. The sharp clack-clack of cobblestones was replaced by the softer, crunching sound of gravel and dirt. The noise of the city faded, replaced by the howling of the wind. We passed the checkpoint, Julian whispered. We're out. He pushed the rear door open slightly. A sliver of moonlight cut through the darkness. They were on a country road. The city of Philadelphia was a glowing ember in the distance behind them. Ahead, the road stretched into a forest of gnarled trees that looked like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. Julian signaled the driver to stop. They climbed out, the cold country air biting at their faces. The driver goes no further, Julian said, handing the man a wad of cash. From here we walk. The path to Blackwood is overgrown. A carriage can't make it. The hearse turned around and rattled back toward the city, leaving them alone in the silence of the countryside. Eleanor looked at the woods ahead. Somewhere in that darkness lay the ruins of the manor, the ice house, and the truth about her father. The architect, Eleanor said, testing the name on her tongue. Do you know who he is? Julian adjusted his coat, checking the revolver he had tucked into his belt, a weapon he hadn't shown her until now. I have a theory, Julian said quietly. But if I'm right, Eleanor, the danger didn't end in the alley. It's waiting for us in those ruins. He looked at her, his face serious. Are you ready? Once we step into those woods, there is no going back to the world of the living. Eleanor touched the locket around her neck. She thought of the men in the alley, the price on her head, the look of fear her father must have had in his final moments. I was never part of the world of the living, Julian, she said, her voice devoid of fear, replaced by a cold resolve. I was just watching it from a library window. I'm ready. She turned and took the first step onto the overgrown path, leading the way into the darkness. The whispers of the alley were behind them. Now, only the whispers of the dead awaited. The forest did not welcome them. It tolerated them, like a beast watching fleas crawl across its flank. Eleanor Vance stumbled over a protruding root, her hands scraping against the rough bark of a hemlock tree to catch herself. The woods north of Philadelphia were old, ancient even. The trees here were gnarled and twisted, their branches interlocking overhead to blot out the few stars that dared to shine through the breaking storm clouds. Watch your step, Julian whispered from ahead. He moved through the underbrush with a grace that unnerved her. Journalists spent their time in smoke-filled newsrooms and city halls, not navigating dense thickets in the dead of night. You know this path well, Eleanor said, her voice barely a breath. She pulled her coat tighter. The damp cold of the woods was different from the city. It settled into the marrow of her bones. I told you, Julian replied, pausing to check a compass by the light of a shielded match. My grandfather was the groundskeeper. I spent my summers here as a boy, before the fire, before the ghosts moved in. He blew out the match, plunging them back into near total darkness. We are close to the perimeter wall. From here on, we don't speak unless necessary. The architect will have eyes in these woods. Eleanor nodded, though he couldn't see her. She touched the pocket of her coat where the iron key lay heavy and cold. They pressed on. The silence of the forest was heavy, broken only by the snap of dry twigs under their boots and the distant, mournful hoot of an owl. As they walked, Eleanor's mind raced. She looked at Julian's back. He was a stranger. A man she had met on a train less than 24 hours ago. He had saved her life, yes, but he also had his own vendetta. "Julian," she whispered. He stopped but didn't turn. "I said no talking." "If we are to do this," Eleanor said, stepping closer to him, "I need to know. You said your grandfather vanished. You think the Blackwoods killed him?" Julian turned slowly. In the gloom, his eyes reflected the faint ambient light of the moon struggling through the canopy. "The Blackwoods were involved in something that required a lot of silence, Eleanor. My grandfather was a man who saw everything. He kept journals, like your father. But he wasn't a surveyor, he was a witness." Julian took a step toward her, his voice dropping to a low growl. "He found things in the ice house. Shipments that arrived at midnight. Crates marked with government seals that didn't exist. He told me once that the Blackwood fortune wasn't built on banking. It was built on treason." "Treason?" Eleanor breathed. "Selling secrets," Julian said. "To the British in 1812. To the Confederates in 61. And now, to whoever the highest bidder is. The oath isn't about patriotism. It's a blood pact of traitors." He looked at the scar on his hand, flexed his fingers. "When the fire happened, they said everyone died. But they never found my grandfather's body. I think he tried to stop them, and I think he's buried somewhere on these grounds." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Her father, a man of maps and logic, had been friends with these people. Had he been a traitor too? "My father," Eleanor started, her voice trembling. "Was he one of them?" Julian looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "I saw the photo, Eleanor. He was shaking hands with Thomas Blackwood. But in the journal, he wrote about atoning. Maybe he didn't know at first. Maybe, like you, he was just drawn into the orbit of a dying star." He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. It was a gesture of comfort, but his grip was firm. "We are an alliance of the sins of our fathers, Eleanor. You are the daughter of the mapmaker. I am the grandson of the keeper. Together, we are the only ones who can unlock the door. But understand this, once we open it, we share the guilt of whatever we find." Eleanor looked into his eyes. She saw fear there, but also a burning resolve. She placed her hand over his. "I don't care about the guilt," she said, her voice steadying. "I want the truth." "Good," Julian said. He released her. "Because we have company." Eleanor froze. "What?" Julian signaled for her to crouch. He pointed through the trees. About 50 yards ahead, a flicker of light danced in the darkness. It was a lantern, and it was moving. "A patrol," Julian hissed. "They're guarding the old carriage road." "We need to go around," Eleanor whispered. "No time," Julian said, checking his revolver. "The ice house is just beyond that ridge. If we go around, we lose an hour. By then, the sun will be up and will be visible for miles. So what do? We create a distraction." Julian looked at her. "Can you run?" "I ran from the bank. I ran from the library. I'm getting quite good at it," Eleanor said dryly. "But take this." He handed her his silver lighter. "Go to that cluster of dry brush over there to the left. When I signal, light it. The smoke will draw him. I'll circle behind." "You're going to kill him?" Eleanor asked, horrified. "I'm going to ensure we survive," Julian said grimly. "Now go." Eleanor hesitated for a heartbeat, then moved. She crept through the underbrush, the wet leaves soaking her skirt. She reached the dry patch of brambles Julian had indicated. She crouched, holding the lighter, her thumb hovering over the wheel. She watched the lantern bobbing closer. She could hear the footsteps now, heavy, deliberate. The guard was humming a tune. It was a cheerful, jaunty tune that seemed grotesquely out of place in the dark woods. She looked for Julian. He had vanished into the shadows. "Signal. Where is the signal?" A low bird call, a mimic of a mourning dove, sounded from the right. Eleanor flicked the lighter. The flame sparked, catching the dry pine needles instantly. The fire flared up, crackling loudly. "Hey!" the guard shouted. The humming stopped. The lantern swung violently toward her direction. "Who's there?" Eleanor didn't wait. She scrambled back, snapping a branch loudly on purpose, then dove behind a thick oak tree. The guard ran toward the fire, drawing a pistol. "Come out! I see you!" He reached the burning bush, his gun raised, scanning the darkness. His back was to the ridge. From the darkness above, a shadow detached itself from the trees. Julian dropped. He landed on the guard's back, the impact driving the air out of the man's lungs. They crashed to the ground, the lantern shattering and extinguishing in the wet mud. A struggle ensued, grunts of exertion, the thud of fists against flesh, the wet sound of boots slipping on leaves. Eleanor watched, her hand over her mouth. This wasn't a story in a book. This was raw, ugly violence. The guard was big. He threw Julian off, scrambling for his dropped gun. "No!" Eleanor screamed. She broke cover. She didn't have a weapon, but she had the element of surprise. She grabbed a heavy, broken branch from the forest floor and swung it with all her might. The wood connected with the guard's arm just as his fingers brushed the pistol. He howled in pain, clutching his wrist. That second of distraction was all Julian needed. He lunged forward, striking the man hard on the temple with the butt of his own revolver. The guard slumped forward, unconscious. Silence returned to the woods, save for the crackling of the small fire Eleanor had started. Julian stood up, chest heaving. He wiped blood from his lip. He looked at the unconscious man, then at Eleanor. He looked shocked. "You!" He panted. "You hit him." "He was going to shoot you," Eleanor said, dropping the branch. Her hands were shaking violently now. "Is he?" "Alive," Julian said, checking the man's pulse. "Just out cold. We have to move. The fire will attract others." He quickly stomped out the small blaze. Then he grabbed the guard's ankles and dragged him into the deep brush, hiding him from sight. "That was reckless," Julian said, walking back to her. "That was an alliance," Eleanor retorted, her eyes flashing. "You watch my back, I watch yours. Remember?" Julian stared at her for a long moment. Then, a genuine smile broke through the grime and blood on his face. It was the first time she had seen him look truly impressed. "Remind me never to make you angry, Miss Vance," he said. "The ridge is clear." They climbed the final rise. The trees began to thin out. As they crested the hill, the moon finally broke through the storm clouds, illuminating the valley below. Eleanor gasped. There, rising from the mist like the skeleton of a leviathan, were the ruins of Blackwood Manor. It was massive. Even in its destroyed state, the scale of it was breathtaking. The main house was a hollow shell, its stone walls blackened by the fire of 20 years ago. The roof was gone, leaving the jagged chimneys pointing at the sky like accusing fingers. Windows, devoid of glass, looked like empty eye sockets staring blindly across the overgrown gardens. Nature had begun to reclaim it. Ivy strangled the stone pillars. Trees grew through what used to be the ballroom. It was a monument to decay. "My God," Eleanor whispered. "It looks evil." "It's just stone and memory," Julian said, though his voice lacked conviction. He pointed to the far side of the estate, where the tree-line met a crumbling stone wall. "The gardens are there. The weeping angel statue should be in the center. And from there—" "The bearing," Eleanor finished. 40 degrees. 75 feet. "To the ice house," Julian nodded. They stood there for a moment looking down at the ruins. The wind howled through the empty structure, creating a sound like a low, mournful moan. "Are you ready?" Julian asked. "Once we go down there, we are in the open. If the architect is here, he will see us." Eleanor touched the locket again. She thought of the man in the alley. She thought of her father's body, slumped over his maps. "I am not afraid of him," Eleanor said. "I am afraid of never knowing why." She took the first step down the slope. "Wait," Julian said. He reached into his coat and pulled out the guard's pistol. He held it out to her. "I saw you swing that branch," he said. "You have the instinct." but this will be more effective against the architect than a piece of wood. Eleanor looked at the gun. It was cold, heavy, and ugly. It was an instrument of death. She took it. The weight of it felt wrong in her archivist's hands, yet strangely necessary. Safety is here. Julian showed her the latch. Point and pull. Try not to shoot me. I'll try, Eleanor said dryly. They descended into the valley, two small figures moving against the backdrop of the immense, ruined estate. The dangerous alliance was sealed, not with ink, but with violence and a shared descent into the dark. As they reached the rusted iron gates of the manor, a flash of lightning illuminated the sky, followed seconds later by a crack of thunder that shook the ground. The storm had returned, and in the window of the highest remaining tower of the ruins, for just a split second, Eleanor thought she saw the flicker of a candle. Someone was home. The ruins of Blackwood Manor were not silent. They whispered with the wind that whistled through shattered window frames and groaned with the shifting of rotting timbers. To Eleanor, it felt less like a building and more like the carcass of a great beast, picked clean by time and scavengers. Eleanor and Julian moved through what had once been the grand foyer. The mosaic floor, now cracked and heaved by weeds, crunched loudly under their boots. Above them, the sky was a bruised purple, the first light of dawn struggling to pierce the retreating storm clouds. "Keep close," Julian murmured, his revolver drawn. He scanned the darkened corners where shadows seemed to pool like black water. Structures like this aren't stable, and we don't know if the architect has men inside. Eleanor gripped the pistol he had given her. It felt alien and heavy, but the fear that had plagued her in Boston had calcified into a cold, hard determination. She wasn't an archivist anymore. She was a treasure hunter in a graveyard. They stepped out through the remains of the French doors onto the rear terrace. The overgrown garden stretched out before them, a tangle of thorns, dead rosebushes, and statues that looked like trapped souls. "The compass," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "Check the bearing." Julian pulled out the brass compass. "We need the starting point. The weeping angel." They pushed through the knee-high grass, fighting against the thorns that snagged their coats. In the center of the garden, rising from a dried-up fountain filled with dead leaves, stood the statue. It was a masterpiece of melancholy. The stone angel knelt, face buried in its hands, wings drooping as if exhausted by the weight of its sorrow. Moss stained its cheeks like green tears. "Here," Eleanor said, standing at the base of the fountain. She opened her father's journal to the page with the coordinates. 40 degrees. 75 feet. Julian aligned the compass. "That way," he pointed, toward the old retaining wall near the tree line. They began to pace it out. Eleanor counted the steps aloud, her heart beating in sync with the numbers. 73, 74, 75. They stopped. There was nothing there, just a patch of dense, tangled ivy covering the stone retaining wall that held back the forest slope. Eleanor's heart sank. "There's nothing here. Did we miss a step? Is the compass wrong?" Julian holstered his gun and stepped forward. He reached into the ivy, ripping away thick handfuls of the vines. "My grandfather said the Blackwoods were masters of illusion. They didn't build walls just to hold back dirt." He pulled harder, tearing a large sheet of vegetation away from the stone. Underneath, the stone wasn't stone at all. It was iron. A heavy, rusted iron door was set into the hillside, almost indistinguishable from the rock around it. It had no handle, only a single, triangular keyhole in the center. Eleanor let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the heavy iron key. The key to box 404. "The ice house," she whispered. She stepped forward and inserted the key. It slid in with a gritty resistance. She grabbed the head of the key with both hands and turned. Groan. The sound was deafening, the shriek of metal that hadn't moved in 20 years. The internal tumblers slammed into place with a sound like a gunshot. The door popped open an inch, exhaling a puff of stale, frigid air. "It's open," Eleanor said, stepping back. Julian pushed the door wide. Darkness yawned before them, a black throat leading into the earth. "Lantern," Julian said. He took a small oil lamp from his satchel, one he had swiped from the boarding house, and lit it. The yellow flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. "I'll go first," Julian said. "Stay 2 steps behind me." They descended. The steps were cut from rough stone, slick with condensation. The air grew colder with every step, a supernatural chill that seeped through their wet clothes. This was an ice house designed to store blocks of river ice through the summer, but it felt like a tomb. At the bottom of the stairs, the room opened up. It was a cavernous, brick-lined chamber. Along the walls, empty shelves stood like ribs. There was no ice, only puddles of brackish water and the smell of rot. But in the center of the room, sitting on a raised stone plinth to keep it away from the melting ice, was a solitary object. A large, black iron safe. "There it is," Julian breathed. "The safe harbor." They approached it cautiously. The safe was old, a formidable box of steel. But unlike the door, this lock had been tampered with. There were scratches around the dial. "Someone tried to break in," Eleanor noted, running her finger over the marks. "But they failed," Julian said. "This is a dual lock system. You need the combination and a key. Or..." He looked at the hinges. "Explosives, which would destroy the contents." "My father's journal," Eleanor said suddenly. "The numbers. 40-04-75. We used them for the location. But what if they serve a dual purpose?" "The combination?" Julian asked. Eleanor knelt before the safe. She put her ear against the cold metal door. She spun the dial. Right to 40. Left to 04. Right to 75. She held her breath and pulled the handle. Nothing happened. "It didn't work," she said, frustration rising in her voice. "Think, Eleanor," Julian urged, scanning the dark room nervously. "Your father was a cartographer. He thought in layers. What else is in the journal?" Eleanor flipped through the pages frantically. Dates. Nothing about a safe. Then she stopped. On the inside cover of the journal, there was a simple inscription written in her father's hand. "To Ellie. Remember the year the world changed." "The year the world changed," Eleanor murmured. "He used to tell me stories about the year I was born. But he also talked about the year the oath was broken." "The fire," Julian said. 1879. "No," Eleanor said, her eyes widening. "The name of the oath. The oath of 1812. She reset the dial. Right to 18. Left to 12. The mechanism gave a heavy, satisfying thunk. Eleanor pulled the handle. The heavy steel door swung open with a screech. Inside, the safe was dry. Resting on the velvet lining were not bars of gold or jewels, but a single, thick book bound in black leather. The hidden ledger. Eleanor reached in and took it. Her hands trembled. This book was the reason her father was dead. This book was the reason she was hunted. "Open it," Julian whispered. Eleanor placed the ledger on the top of the safe and opened the cover. The pages were filled with columns of handwriting. Different hands, different inks, spanning decades. She read the first entry, dated 1812. Payment received from Lord Liverpool. For the secure passage of British naval intelligence. Authorized by E. Blackwood. "My God," Julian whispered. "They were spies. During the war. They sold the blockade routes to the British." Eleanor turned the pages. The dates moved forward. 1863, 1880, 1895. Payment for the diversion of Union supply trains. Payment for the suppression of the coal miners' union evidence. Payment for the assassination of Senator H. It was a catalog of corruption. A history of America written in blood and bribes. The Blackwoods hadn't just been bankers. They had been the brokers of chaos, profiting from every tragedy that befell the nation. "Look at the names," Julian said, pointing to a column labeled Associates. Eleanor scanned the list. She saw names of politicians, judges, police captains. And then, near the bottom, under the year 1890, she saw 2 names that made her blood freeze. Surveyor, Samuel Vance. Groundskeeper, Arthur Thorne. Eleanor gasped, pulling her hand back as if the page burned her. "No." Julian went silent. He stared at the name Arthur Thorne. "They weren't just witnesses," Eleanor whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "They worked for them. My father, he mapped the routes for the smugglers. Your grandfather, he hid the bodies. We aren't the heroes of this story, Eleanor, Julian said, his voice hollow. We are the children of the villains. They tried to get out, Eleanor said, pointing to the final entry, dated 3 years ago. Vance and Thorne threaten exposure. Requesting release from the oath. Request denied. Authorization for termination. The architect. They didn't die because they found out, Julian realized. They died because they grew a conscience. They tried to stop it. He looked at Eleanor. The romantic idea of clearing their family names was gone. The truth was far uglier. Their families were guilty, but they had died trying to make amends. We have the book, Julian said, closing the heavy cover. This brings down everyone. The judges, the police, the architect. This burns the whole corrupt house down. We have to get it to the press. To New York, Eleanor said, clutching the ledger to her chest. Suddenly, a sound echoed from the top of the stone stairs. Clap, clap, clap. Slow, sarcastic applause. Eleanor and Julian spun around, Julian raising his revolver. Standing at the top of the stairs, framed by the gray light of dawn, was a silhouette. A tall, thin man in a long coat. He leaned heavily on a cane that glinted silver in the dim light. Bravo! The man's voice echoed down the stone shaft. It was a cultured, smooth voice, like velvet over gravel. I must admit, I didn't think the surveyor's daughter had the spine for it. And young Mr. Thorne, you look just like your grandfather before I slit his throat. Julian's hand shook, his finger tightening on the trigger. You're him. You're the architect. The man stepped down one step. Behind him, 3 other men appeared, all holding shotguns leveled at Eleanor and Julian. The architect is a title boy, the man sneered. My name is Blackwood. Silas Blackwood. And I believe you have something that belongs to my family. He extended a gloved hand. Give me the ledger, Silas said, and I will grant you a quick death. Refuse, and you will stay in this ice house forever, just like old Arthur. Eleanor looked at Julian. They were trapped underground. Outnumbered. Outgunned. And they held the most dangerous book in America. Julian looked at her. His eyes were wild, desperate. He looked at the ledger, then at the men with guns. Julian? Eleanor whispered. Julian slowly lowered his gun. We can't win this, Eleanor, he said softly. He reached out and took the ledger from her hands. Julian, what are you doing? She hissed. Julian didn't look at her. He looked up at Silas Blackwood. If I give you the book, Julian called out, his voice shaking, do I walk away? Does the girl walk away? Julian, don't. Eleanor screamed, grabbing his arm. He shoved her back. Eleanor stumbled, falling against the cold stone of the safe. I asked you a question. Julian shouted at Blackwood. Deal, Silas smiled, a predator sensing weakness. Bring it up. Julian began to walk up the stairs, the ledger in his hand, leaving Eleanor alone in the dark at the bottom of the pit. The silence in the ice house was heavier than the stone blocks that formed its walls. It was a suffocating, tangible thing, broken only by the sound of Julian Thorne's boots scraping against the stairs as he ascended toward the light. Eleanor Vance stood at the bottom of the pit, her back pressed against the cold iron of the open safe. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched the man she had trusted, the man who had pulled her from the burning library, the man who had shared the darkness of a hearse with her, walk away with the only leverage they had. Julian, she screamed, her voice cracking. Don't do this. Julian paused on the 3rd step from the top. He didn't turn around. He stood rigid, his silhouette framed by the gray dawn light and the menacing figures of Silas Blackwood's men. It's over, Eleanor, Julian said. His voice was flat, devoid of the warmth or humor that had defined him hours ago. I told you, we are the children of villains. Maybe survival is the only family trait we inherited. He took the final steps and emerged onto the grass level. Silas Blackwood stood there, leaning on his silver cane, a smile of genuine amusement curling his thin lips. He looked at Julian, then down at the ledger in Julian's hand. A sensible young man, Silas purred. Your grandfather was stubborn. He thought honor was a currency. You, it seems, understand the value of real currency. Silas extended his hand. The book. Julian hesitated for a fraction of a second. He looked down into the pit, where Eleanor's pale face looked up at him from the shadows. Her eyes were wide with shock and a hurt so deep it looked like physical pain. Julian looked away. He placed the heavy black ledger into Silas Blackwood's hand. The names, the dates, the bribes, Julian said, his voice steady. It's all there. Every sin your family committed for the last 80 years. Silas caressed the cover of the book like a lover. Sins? Investments. This is the foundation of the new century. He handed the book to one of his guards. Secure this in the carriage. Burn it once we are back at the city house. Now let me go, Julian said. That was the deal. Silas laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. Deals are for peers, Mr. Thorne. You are a loose end. I am a journalist, Julian countered quickly. If I disappear, people ask questions. If I walk away, I write a story about a failed investigation. A dead end. You stay a ghost. I stay alive. Silas studied him, tapping his chin with the silver head of his cane. He looked at the gun in Julian's belt, then at the desperate look in his eyes. You have the cowardice of a survivor, Silas mused. Very well. I have no wish to draw more attention to these ruins by adding fresh bodies if I don't have to. Silas waved his hand toward the forest path. Go. Run back to your ink and paper. But if I ever see your byline in a paper again, I will find you. Julian nodded once. He didn't look back at the pit. He didn't look back at Eleanor. He turned and walked past the guards, disappearing into the mist of the morning woods. Eleanor watched him go. The disbelief washed away, replaced by a cold, hollow void. He had left her. He had actually left her. Silas Blackwood stepped to the edge of the pit. He looked down at Eleanor, his expression shifting from amusement to boredom. And now regarding you, Miss Vance, Silas sighed. The daughter of the mapmaker. You have your father's eyes. It's a pity you also have his meddlesome nature. You killed him, Eleanor said, her voice trembling with rage. You killed him for a book. I killed him because he forgot his place, Silas corrected. He thought he could blackmail the architect. He didn't understand that you don't negotiate with gravity. You just fall. Silas turned to the two men remaining with him. Both held double-barreled shotguns. Finish it, Silas ordered casually, turning his back. Make it look like a structural collapse. The ruins are dangerous, after all. The two men stepped to the edge of the stairs, raising their weapons. The black holes of the barrels looked like eyes of death staring down at her. Eleanor's mind went blank. This was it. This was how it ended. Not with a revelation, but with a bang in a cold, dark hole. Clang. A deafening, metallic crash echoed through the ruins. The sunlight vanished. Total darkness swallowed the room. Above, the men were shouting. What the hell? The door! Someone yelled. He kicked the door. Eleanor stood frozen in the pitch black. The heavy iron door at the top of the stairs, the one concealed by ivy, had been slammed shut. Open it! Silas's voice screamed from outside, muffled by the thick iron. Open it, you fools! It's locked, sir. The latch, it snapped into place. He has the key. Silas roared. Thorne, find him. Kill him. Eleanor realized what had happened. Julian hadn't just left. As he walked away, he must have doubled back or used a trick to kick the heavy door shut, locking the guards out and sealing Eleanor in. He hadn't betrayed her to death. He had trapped her to save her from the bullets. But now, she was buried alive. Eleanor fumbled in the darkness, her hands outstretched. Julian, she whispered, though he couldn't hear her. Outside, the sounds of shouting faded. Gunshots rang out in the distance. 1, 2, 3 cracks of a revolver, followed by the boom of a shotgun. Then silence. Was he dead? Had he tried to fight them alone? Eleanor was alone in the dark. The air in the ice house was stale and limited. She had the safe, the empty shelves, and the rising panic of claustrophobia. She fell to her knees, sobbing. The betrayal felt even more complex now. He had saved her life, yes, but he had handed the proof of their family's innocence to the devil and left her entombed. Think, Eleanor, she told herself, forcing her breathing to slow. You are an archivist. You organize chaos. Think. She crawled to the safe. The lantern Julian had left was gone. He had taken it or extinguished it. She reached into her pocket. Matches. She struck one. The flare of light was blinding for a second. The room was exactly as before. Wet brick walls. The safe. The stairs leading up to the sealed iron door. But something caught her eye. The smoke from the match. It wasn't rising straight up. It was drifting sideways, toward the back of the chamber, behind the safe. Airflow. If there was air moving, there was a vent. Eleanor scrambled to the back of the room, holding the match until it burned her fingers. She lit another. Behind the heavy iron safe, near the floor, there was a small, rusted grate. It was a drainage tunnel, designed to let the melted ice water flow out of the chamber. It was small, barely wide enough for a child. But Eleanor was slender, and fear was a powerful lubricant. She grabbed the grate. It was rusted solid. Come on, she gritted her teeth, pulling with all her strength. For Papa. The rust flaked, cutting her hands, but the grate didn't move. She needed a lever. She looked around. There was nothing loose. Then she remembered the gun. Julian's revolver. She had dropped it when he pushed her. She scrambled on the floor, sweeping her hands through the icy mud until her fingers brushed cold steel. She grabbed the gun. Using the barrel of the revolver as a pry bar, she wedged it into the lattice of the grate and pulled. The grate groaned and popped free, clattering onto the stones. A draft of air, smelling of wet earth and rotting leaves, hit her face. It was the sweetest smell she had ever known. She didn't know where the tunnel led. It could be a mile long. It could be blocked. It could be full of rats. But behind her was a sealed door and men who wanted her dead. Eleanor squeezed into the narrow, wet tunnel. The darkness pressed in on her from all sides. The walls scraped her shoulders. The water soaked her dress, chilling her to the bone. She crawled, inch by inch, dragging her body through the slime. I will survive, she thought, her anger burning hotter than the fear. I will survive, and I will find Julian Thorne. And if he really betrayed me, I will kill him myself. Above ground, the sun was fully up now. The storm had passed. Silas Blackwood stood by the sealed door of the ice house, his face a mask of fury. His men had returned from the woods, empty-handed. He's gone, sir, the guard panted. Vanished into the ravine. He moves like a ghost. Silas gripped his cane until his knuckles turned white. He had the ledger. That was the most important thing. But he hated loose ends. Leave the door, Silas commanded. The girl is trapped. The air will run out in a few hours. Nature will do what you incompetents could not. He turned to the carriage waiting on the overgrown drive. Back to the city. We have a new era to build. Silas climbed into the carriage, placing the ledger on the seat beside him. He didn't notice that the leather strap of the book was loose. As the carriage rattled away, bumping over the roots and stones of the ruined estate, a single piece of paper slipped out from the pages of the ledger and fluttered to the floor of the carriage. It wasn't a bank record. It was a note, written in fresh ink, in a hurried scrawl. To the reader, this is only volume 1. The index is hidden where the water meets the iron. Silas didn't see it. The carriage disappeared down the road. Deep underground, Eleanor saw a faint speck of light at the end of the tunnel. She wasn't dead yet, and the game wasn't over. Eleanor Vance emerged from the earth like a creature born of mud and vengeance. The drainage tunnel spilled out into a shallow, reed-choked creek about a quarter-mile downhill from the ruins. She tumbled out of the rusted pipe, gasping for air, her body racked with shivering. The water was freezing, but the air, the sweet, sharp air of the living world, tasted like salvation. She lay there for a long time, half submerged in the icy water, staring up at the canopy of trees. Her hands were raw and bleeding from prying open the grate. Her dress, once a modest archivist's garment, was torn at the hem and coated in the slime of the tunnel. She was alive. But as the initial rush of survival faded, The crushing weight of reality settled in. She was alone in the woods. She had no allies. Her father's killer held the ledger. And Julian, the name was a jagged shard of glass in her mind. Had he betrayed her to save his own skin? Or had he locked that door to save hers? Eleanor pushed herself up, her limbs screaming in protest. She crawled onto the muddy bank and checked the revolver. It was caked in mud, useless in its current state. She wiped it on the dry patch of grass, checking the cylinder. 3 bullets left. "Get up, Eleanor," she whispered to herself. Her voice sounded strange, hoarse and deeper than before. "Get up or you die here." She began to walk. Not back to the ruins, there was nothing there for her now but ghosts, but toward the distant sound of a train whistle. The walk to the nearest rail depot took 4 hours. Eleanor stuck to the tree line, avoiding the roads. She found a scarecrow in a dormant cornfield and stole its rough canvas coat to cover her ruined dress. It smelled of mildew and straw, but it was warm. She reached the small depot of Fort Washington just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. She had no money. Her satchel was gone, left in the hearse or the woods. But she had the gold locket around her neck. Her mother's locket. The station master was an old man with cataracts who didn't ask questions. He looked at the disheveled woman in the canvas coat, then at the gold locket she placed on the counter. "One way to Philadelphia," Eleanor said. "That's a fine piece of jewelry, miss," the man wheezed. "Worth 10 tickets. "I only need one," she said. "Keep the change." She boarded the train. It was a freight train carrying lumber, with a single passenger car at the back. She sat in the corner, pulling the coat tight. The rhythm of the tracks, clack clack, clack clack, was hypnotic. It lulled her into a trance-like state where time seemed to blur. She thought of her father, Samuel, the quiet man who drew maps. She realized now that his silence hadn't been a lack of love. It had been protection. He had built a wall of silence to keep the storm of the Blackwoods away from her. And she thought of Julian Thorne. The way he had looked at her before he walked up those stairs. There had been no apology in his eyes, only a grim calculation. He gave them the book, she thought. But if he wanted money, he could have taken it years ago. If he wanted safety, he wouldn't have come to the ruins. He's planning something, she realized. Or he's walking into a trap. The train slowed. The lights of Philadelphia appeared in the distance, a sprawling constellation of gas lights and electric bulbs. The city looked different to her now. It wasn't a place of history and libraries anymore. It was a machine, a grinder of human souls. And she was heading straight back into its gears. The city was wet. The storm that had ravaged the woods had passed over the city, leaving the streets slick and shining black under the street lamps. Eleanor disembarked at a secondary station in the industrial district to avoid any Pinkertons watching the main terminals. She walked through the steam and smoke, blending in with the factory shift workers. She needed a base, a place to clean the gun, place to think. She found a cheap boarding house near the textile mills. The sign said rooms 25 cents. She used the cash the station master had given her. He had insisted on giving her some bills back, bless his soul. The room was tiny, holding only a bed and a wash basin. Eleanor locked the door. She stripped off the filthy canvas coat and her ruined dress. She washed the mud from her skin with cold water from the pitcher. As she scrubbed the grime away, she looked at herself in the cracked mirror above the basin. The woman staring back was unrecognizable. Her cheekbones were sharper. Her eyes, usually soft and inquisitive, were hard and dark. There was a bruise blooming on her jawline. She wasn't Eleanor the archivist anymore. That woman had died in the ice house. She sat on the bed and laid the revolver on the quilt. She disassembled it, cleaning the mud from the springs and the barrel with the hem of her petticoat. She worked with a mechanical precision she didn't know she possessed. Snip. The gun was reassembled. She spun the cylinder. It moved smoothly. She was armed. She was anonymous. But she was blind. She didn't know where Silas was. She needed information. Eleanor dressed in her dry, albeit torn, clothes and put the canvas coat back on. It gave her the look of a vagrant, which was a disguise in itself. She left the room and went out into the night. She found a newsstand on the corner. A young boy was shouting headlines. Extra, extra. Shipping magnate announces new foundation. Strikes end at the docks. Eleanor bought a paper. She stood under a gaslight, scanning the front page. There was a large photograph of Silas Blackwood. He was clean, elegant, and smiled benevolently. He looked nothing like the monster who had ordered her execution hours ago. The headline read, Silas Blackwood TO host Gala of the Century, tonight at the Union League. Tonight. The article described a celebration of new civic alliances. It mentioned that the city's elite, judges, politicians, police chiefs, would all be in attendance to honor Blackwood's donation to the city. It was a victory lap. Silas believed Eleanor was dead. He believed Julian was gone. He believed the ledger was destroyed. He was gathering all his corrupt associates in one room to celebrate their total control over the city. Eleanor crushed the newspaper in her hand. The Union League. It was the most exclusive club in Philadelphia, a fortress of wealth and power. If she wanted to end this, she had to go there. But how? She looked like a beggar. She had a gun with 3 bullets. And the building would be guarded by half the police force. She needed an entry. As she stared at the paper, a smaller article in the bottom corner caught her eye. Body found in Schuylkill River. Police report the discovery of an unidentified male, mid-20s, found near the rail yards. Cause of death appears to be drowning. No identification found. Eleanor's heart stopped. Mid-20s. Unidentified. Was it Julian? Had Silas lied? Had he killed Julian the moment he handed over the book and dumped him in the river? She felt a wave of nausea. If Julian was dead, she was truly alone. The dangerous alliance was just one woman with a rusty gun. She leaned against the brick wall, fighting the urge to vomit. Spare a dime, miss? Eleanor looked down. A beggar was sitting on the wet pavement, huddled under a blanket. She looked at him, then back at the article. If Julian was dead, there was no rescue coming. No clever plan. Just revenge. But if he wasn't dead, where was he? She thought about Julian. He was a chameleon. He could be a drunk in an alley, a gentleman on a train. If he was alive, he wouldn't be hiding. He would be where the action was. He'll be at the gala, she thought with sudden certainty. If he gave up the book, he has a plan B. And plan B happens tonight. Eleanor dropped a coin into the beggar's cup. Thank you, ma'am. She turned and walked toward the wealthier district. She needed a way into the Union League. She couldn't walk in the front door. She walked for blocks, her mind racing. She passed a theater where a show was letting out. Wealthy women in furs and silk were stepping into carriages. Eleanor stopped. She looked at her reflection in a shop window. Then she looked at the alley behind the theater. She saw a door propped open. A costume trunk was sitting near the loading dock. It was reckless. It was criminal. But she was already a dead woman walking. She slipped into the alley. 10 minutes later, she emerged. The canvas coat was gone. She was wearing a black velvet opera cloak she had filched from the costume trunk. It was slightly too big, but it covered her torn dress. She had rubbed some dirt from her face, pinned her hair up. She looked like a lady who had fallen on hard times, or perhaps an eccentric artist. It wasn't perfect, but in the dark, it would pass. She hailed a cab. The Union League, she commanded, affecting the haughty tone of the Back Bay socialites she used to observe in Boston. The driver didn't blink. Right away, ma'am. The building was a palace of red brick and sandstone, blazing with light. Carriages lined the street for blocks. Music, a Strauss waltz, drifted out from the open balcony doors. Eleanor stood in the shadows across the street. She watched the guests entering. The men who ran the city. The men whose names were in the ledger. She gripped the revolver inside the pocket of her velvet cloak. This was calm. The music, the laughter, the clinking of champagne glasses. Inside, they were celebrating their crimes. She took a deep breath. The air was cold, but her blood was hot. She crossed the street. She didn't go to the main entrance. She went to the side, to the servants' entrance where delivery crates were being unloaded. "Hey, you can't be here," a steward shouted, blocking her path. Eleanor looked at him. She pulled the cloak open slightly, just enough to show the handle of the revolver. "I am not here for the food," she said, her voice ice cold. "I am here for Mr. Blackwood. And if you make a sound, the music stops early." The steward went pale. He stepped aside, his hands trembling. Eleanor slipped past him, into the warm, noisy belly of the beast. She moved through the kitchens, dodging waiters carrying trays of oysters and champagne. She found a service stairwell and began to climb. With every step, the music got louder. The storm was no longer approaching. She was in it. She reached the top of the stairs and pushed open the door. She was in the ballroom. It was a sea of color and light. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Hundreds of people were dancing. And there, in the center of the room, holding a glass of champagne, was Silas Blackwood. He was laughing, his hand resting on the shoulder of the police commissioner. Eleanor stepped into the crowd. She kept her hand in her pocket, her finger on the trigger. She moved toward him. 30 feet. 20 feet. Then she saw him. Standing near the orchestra, holding a violin case, was a man in a tuxedo. He looked tired. He looked battered. It was Julian. He wasn't dead in the river. He was here. He wasn't looking at Silas. He was looking at the clock on the wall. 10 o'clock. Julian's eyes scanned the crowd and locked onto Eleanor. His eyes widened in genuine shock. He mouthed one word. Eleanor froze. Why run? Then she saw what was happening. Julian wasn't holding a violin case. He was positioning it under the main support pillar of the balcony. He hadn't come to arrest them. He hadn't come to expose them. He had come to bring the house down. Literally. The calm was over. Eleanor looked at Silas, then at Julian, then at the hundreds of innocent wives and daughters in the room. If Julian triggered whatever was in that case, everyone would die. The villains, yes, but also the innocent. Eleanor had to make a choice. Revenge or humanity? She stepped forward, pulling the gun from her pocket. "Silas Blackwood," she screamed, her voice cutting through the waltz like a knife. The music stopped. Silence crashed into the room. Silas turned, his smile vanishing. He stared at the woman in the black velvet cloak. "You," he whispered. "The ledger is not the only thing that survived the fire," Eleanor announced, leveling the gun at his chest. The crowd screamed. The storm had arrived. The silence that fell over the grand ballroom was absolute. Seconds ago, the room had been a cacophony of Strauss waltzes, clinking crystal, and the murmur of the city's elite. Now, the only sound was the heavy, ragged breathing of Eleanor Vance. She stood in the center of the polished parquet floor, a solitary figure in a stolen, oversized velvet cloak. In her hand, the dark steel of the revolver held steady, aimed directly at the chest of the most powerful man in Philadelphia. Silas Blackwood stood on the low dais, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips. The smile he had been wearing, a smile of triumph and benevolence, didn't vanish instantly. It curdled slowly into a look of mild irritation, as if a fly had landed in his wine. "Miss Vance," Silas said, his voice projecting effortlessly across the silent room. "I was told you had met with a tragic accident in the ruins. It seems my staff is incompetent." "The only accident was your belief that you could bury the truth," Eleanor declared. Her voice shook slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Tell them, Silas. Tell them about the ice house. Tell them about the ledger." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Men in tuxedos whispered to their wives. The police commissioner, standing next to Silas, reached slowly inside his coat for his weapon. "Ladies and gentlemen," Silas announced, spreading his arms wide, looking the picture of a magnanimous host. "Please, do not be alarmed. This poor woman is the daughter of a former employee. A mental invalid, sadly. Grief has driven her to madness." He looked at the commissioner. "Commissioner, would you kindly escort this hysterical woman to a cell where she can get the help she needs?" "Don't move," Eleanor shouted, swinging the gun toward the commissioner. The crowd gasped and surged back, creating a wide circle around her. "The first man who takes a step dies." "You won't shoot," Silas sneered, stepping down from the dais. He walked toward her, his cane tapping rhythmically on the floor. You are an archivist, Eleanor. You preserve history, you don't make it. You don't have the killer instinct. He was closing the distance. 30 feet. 20 feet. Eleanor's finger tightened on the trigger. He was right. She had never fired a gun at a human being. Her hands were sweating. The sheer weight of the lion's den, the hundreds of staring eyes, the power arrayed against her, was crushing her resolve. "Drop the gun, child," Silas said softly, his voice hypnotic. "It's over." "He's right, Eleanor." The voice came from behind her. Eleanor didn't turn, but she knew the voice. It was Julian. Silas looked up, his eyes narrowing. He looked past Eleanor to the pillar near the orchestra pit. Julian Thorne stepped out from the shadows. He looked like a man who had walked through hell to get to a black-tie dinner. His tuxedo was dusty, his face bruised, and his eyes were wild. In his hands, he held the violin case. He had placed it on a serving table and flipped the latches open. "She won't shoot you, Silas," Julian said, his voice carrying a deadly calm. "Because shooting you is too quick." Julian reached into the violin case. He didn't pull out an instrument. He pulled out a bundle of red dynamite sticks, wired together to a clock mechanism. The scream that tore through the ballroom was primal. "Bomb!" someone shrieked. Pandemonium erupted. The orderly crowd dissolved into a stampede of silk and terror. Women fainted, men shoved each other to get to the doors. The orchestra knocked over their stands in their haste to flee. "Nobody leaves." Julian roared. He struck a match and held it inches from the fuse. The stampede froze. The exits were blocked by the sheer volume of bodies. The room was trapped. Silas Blackwood stopped walking. For the first time, the mask of arrogance slipped. He looked at the dynamite, then at Julian. "You're bluffing," Silas hissed. "You're a survivor, Thorne. You proved that in the woods. You won't blow yourself up." "I have nothing left to survive for," Julian said. He looked at Eleanor. His eyes were full of apology. "You should have stayed in the woods, Eleanor. This was the only way to clean the slate." "Julian, no." Eleanor lowered her gun, turning to him. "There are innocent people here. This isn't justice, it's murder. There are no innocents in this room." Julian shouted back, his hand shaking near the fuse. "Look at them. The judges who signed the warrants. The bankers who laundered the money. They are the oath. If I burn this building, I burn the infection. And you burn yourself." Eleanor screamed. She walked toward him, ignoring the danger. "My father didn't die so you could become a monster, Julian. Put it down. Stay back." Julian warned. "Mr. Blackwood." The police commissioner had used the distraction to flank them. He leveled his service revolver at Julian. "Drop the match or I drop you." The situation was a powder keg. A woman with a gun, a man with a bomb, and a police force ready to fire. Silas Blackwood laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that cut through the tension. "Go ahead," Silas said to the commissioner. "Shoot him. If he drops the match, we all die. It's a poetic ending, don't you think?" Silas looked at Julian. "Do it, boy. Light it. Let's see if you have the courage of your grandfather." Julian stared at the flame. He looked at Silas, the man who had ruined his life. Then he looked at Eleanor, the woman who had saved it. He couldn't do it. Not while she was in the room. Julian blew out the match. "Coward," Silas whispered triumphantly. "Commissioner, take them." The commissioner lunged forward. "Duck." Julian yelled at Eleanor. He didn't light the fuse. Instead, he grabbed the entire bundle of dynamite and hurled it, not at the people, but at the massive crystal chandelier hanging directly above the dais. He hadn't lit the fuse, but the impact was enough to shatter the delicate chain holding the ton of crystal and brass. The chandelier fell like a meteor. It smashed into the dais where Silas had been standing moments before, exploding into a million shards of razor-sharp glass. The impact shook the floorboards and sent a cloud of dust and debris billowing into the room. Silas had dived aside just in time, rolling across the floor, his suit covered in glass dust. "Run!" Julian grabbed Eleanor's hand. The room was in chaos. The dust cloud provided a momentary smokescreen. The police were coughing, blinded. Julian and Eleanor sprinted toward the kitchen service doors. "Stop them!" Silas screamed from the floor, wiping blood from a cut on his forehead. "Kill them!" A shot rang out. The bullet splintered the doorframe inches from Eleanor's head. She didn't stop. She turned and fired blindly behind her, 1-2 shots, just to keep their heads down. They burst through the double doors into the kitchen. Waiters were cowering under tables. Pots and pans clattered as Julian shoved a prep table in front of the doors to block the pursuers. "The alley!" Julian shouted. "We have to get to the alley!" They ran through the steamy kitchen, slipping on spilled grease. They burst out the back door into the cold night air. But the alley wasn't empty. 2 uniformed officers were waiting by the loading dock. They saw the couple emerge, Eleanor with a gun, Julian in a dusty tuxedo. "Halt!" one officer shouted, raising his baton. Julian didn't slow down. He lowered his shoulder and slammed into the officer like a freight train, knocking him into a stack of crates. The second officer reached for his whistle. Eleanor pointed her empty gun at him. "Don't," she gasped. The officer hesitated, eyeing the dark barrel. That second was all they needed. They sprinted past him, turning the corner onto the main street. "Where are we going?" Eleanor panted, her lungs burning. "They'll block the streets." "The subway!" Julian gasped. "The construction tunnels on Broad Street. They aren't open yet." They ran. Behind them, whistles blew. The sounds of police carriages rattling over cobblestones grew louder. The lion's den had been stirred, and now the hunters were loose. They reached the construction site of the new subway line. A wooden barrier blocked the entrance to a deep pit in the road. "Jump!" Julian commanded. They vaulted over the barrier and slid down a mound of dirt into the darkness of the unfinished tunnel. They tumbled to the bottom, landing in a heap of mud and gravel. Above them, the sounds of the city continued. Shouts, whistles, the clatter of hooves. But down here, in the cool, damp earth, they were hidden. Julian rolled onto his back, gasping for air. He wiped dirt from his face. He looked at Eleanor. "You," he wheezed. "You came back. You came back for me." Eleanor sat up, checking her revolver. It was empty. She threw it aside in frustration. "I came back to stop you from becoming a murderer," she said sharply, though her voice lacked its usual bite. She was trembling. "You were going to kill everyone." "I was going to end it," Julian said quietly. "Silas has the book, Eleanor. He won. Tonight was his coronation. I wanted to make it his funeral." "He doesn't have the book," Eleanor said. Julian froze. "What?" "He has the ledger," Eleanor said, looking at him in the dim light filtering from the street above. "But he doesn't have the index." Julian sat up. "The index? I found a note in the carriage." Eleanor lied. She had to lie. She couldn't tell him she had only seen a note fall. She needed him to have hope. Or rather, I saw a note fall from the book before Silas took it. It said the index is hidden separately. Without the index, the ledger is just a list of payments. It doesn't prove who the people are. The codes, the names, they are meaningless without the key. Julian stared at her. "You mean Silas has a locked box but no key?" "Exactly," Eleanor said. "He thinks he won. But he can't decrypt the names of the politicians. He can't blackmail anyone until he finds the index." "Where is it?" Julian asked, his energy returning. The note said, "Where the water meets the iron." Eleanor quoted the scrap of paper she had seen in her mind's eye. Julian frowned. "Water meets iron? That could be anything. The docks? The shipyard? A bridge? We have to figure it out," Eleanor said. "And we have to do it before Silas realizes his prize is useless." She looked at Julian's bruised face. "You saved me in the ice house. You locked the door." "I did," Julian admitted. "I couldn't watch them shoot you." "And tonight," Eleanor said, reaching out to touch his arm. "You blew out the match. You saved me again." "I couldn't watch you burn," Julian whispered. They sat there in the dark tunnel for a moment, the sounds of the manhunt echoing above them. They were battered, bloody, and hunted by the entire city. But they were alive. and they had a new lead. "We need to move," Julian said, standing up and offering her his hand. "These tunnels connect to the sewers. We can get to the river." Eleanor took his hand. "Into the darkness again?" "Better than the lion's den," Julian grimaced. As they began to walk deeper into the tunnel, Eleanor realized something. The fear was gone. The hesitation was gone. The archivist who worried about dust on old books was dead. In her place was a woman who had held a room of tyrants hostage. A woman who had walked into the lion's den and walked out again. "Julian," she said. "Yes." "Next time," she said, a small, fierce smile playing on her lips, "let me handle the explosives." Julian laughed, a short, sharp sound in the dark. "Deal." They vanished into the shadows of the underground, leaving the chaos of the surface world behind. The battle was lost, but the war for the index had just begun. The underworld of Philadelphia smelled of rot, ancient brick, and the salty backwash of the Delaware River. Eleanor Vance and Julian Thorne waded through knee-deep water in a storm drain that emptied out near the Navy Yard. They were unrecognizable from the pair that had entered the Union League hours ago. Julian's tuxedo was shredded and caked in mud. Eleanor's stolen velvet cloak was heavy with sewage water, dragging behind her like a broken wing. "We have to stop," Eleanor gasped, leaning against the slimy brick wall. Her legs were trembling uncontrollably. "We can't," Julian urged, though he sounded equally exhausted. He held a small box of matches, their only source of light, shielding the flame with a cupped hand. If Silas realizes the ledger is encrypted, he will tear the city apart to find the key. We have to figure out the riddle. Eleanor closed her eyes, forcing her mind to ignore the cold and the stench. She focused on the scrap of paper she had visualized falling from the ledger. "Where the water meets the iron." "It's not a metaphor," Eleanor said, her voice echoing in the tunnel. "My father was a cartographer. He dealt in physical landmarks. He hated poetry." "Water and iron," Julian muttered. "A bridge? The waterworks?" "No," Eleanor shook her head. "It has to be connected to the Blackwoods. Where did their money come from before the banking?" Julian looked at her, the match illuminating the realization in his eyes. "The foundry. The Blackwood Ironworks. It sits right on the Delaware River. They used to float the raw ore down from the mountains and smelt it there." "Is it still standing?" "Standing? It's the heart of the district," Julian said. "It runs 24 hours a day. It's a hellscape of blast furnaces and molten slag. If your father wanted to hide something where no one would dare look, he would hide it in the fire," Eleanor finished. "Let's go," Julian said, extinguishing the match. "It's a mile east. We stick to the tunnels." The Blackwood Ironworks did not sleep. It roared. Even from the outside, the heat was palpable. 3 massive smokestacks belched black soot into the night sky, obscuring the moon. The building was a fortress of corrugated iron and red brick, glowing from the inside with the orange pulse of the blast furnaces. The rhythmic clang boom of the drop hammers shook the ground beneath their feet. Eleanor and Julian emerged from a drainage pipe on the riverbank, hidden by the steam rising from the cooling water discharge. "How do we get in?" Eleanor shouted over the roar of the machinery. "The cooling intake." Julian pointed to a massive grate where river water was being sucked into the factory. "It's dangerous. The current is strong, but it bypasses the guards at the gate." They stripped off their heavy outer layers, the ruined cloak, the tuxedo jacket. They had to be light. They slipped into the freezing river. The current grabbed them instantly, pulling them toward the dark maw of the intake pipe. They fought the water, grabbing onto the rusted iron bars of the maintenance ladder on the side of the channel. They climbed up, shivering, and squeezed through a service hatch. They were inside. The transition was violent. They went from the freezing cold of the river to the searing heat of the foundry floor in seconds. The interior was a cavern of fire. Massive crucibles of molten iron traveled overhead on chains, spilling sparks like golden rain. Men stripped to the waist, covered in soot and sweat, shoveled coal into roaring furnaces. The noise was deafening, a symphony of industry and violence. "Stay low," Julian shouted, pulling Eleanor behind a stack of pig iron ingots. If they see us, they won't ask questions. Accidents happen here every day. Eleanor scanned the vast floor. Where the water meets the iron. We are near the intake. This is the water source. She looked at the massive, intricate piping system that ran along the east wall. The cold river water was pumped into a giant boiler to create steam for the hammers. At the base of the main boiler, there was a plaque. An iron plate bolted to the floor. It read, "Founded 1812. By fire we forge." There. Eleanor pointed. The cornerstone. They ran, dodging a cart of hot slag that a worker was pushing. The heat was blistering. Eleanor felt her hair crisping at the ends. They reached the cornerstone. It was a massive block of granite set into the brick floor, right where the cold water pipe entered the boiler. "It's sealed," Julian yelled, examining the seams. "We need a crowbar." He looked around and grabbed a heavy iron pry bar from a tool rack. He jammed it into the crack of the stone. "Help me." Eleanor grabbed the bar. Together they pulled. The stone groaned, grinding against the mortar. "Heave!" Julian grunted. With a final, agonizing push, the stone shifted. Underneath, in a small hollowed-out cavity, sat a metal cylinder. It was made of brass, unaffected by the rust or the damp. Eleanor reached in and grabbed it. It was hot to the touch. She unscrewed the cap. Inside was a roll of vellum paper. She unrolled it. It was a grid, a cipher key, and at the top, the header read, "The index, key to the Blackwood ledger." "We have it," Eleanor breathed, clutching the paper. "We actually have it." The main doors of the foundry burst open. The roar of the factory seemed to die down as 20 men stormed onto the catwalks above. They weren't workers. They were armed men in long coats. And leading them, standing on the high gantry overlooking the floor, was Silas Blackwood. He looked down at them like a vengeful god. His face was bandaged where the glass had cut him, and his suit was scorched. "I knew you would come back to the source," Silas's voice boomed, amplified by the acoustics of the cavern. "The rat always returns to the nest." Julian pulled Eleanor behind the boiler. "He tracked us." No, Eleanor realized. He knew the riddle. He just beat us to the punch. He was waiting for us to dig it up. "Fire!" Silas screamed from the gantry. Gunshots rained down from the catwalks. Bullets sparked off the iron boiler, sending shrapnel flying. "We're pinned down," Julian yelled, checking his empty pockets. He had no weapon. "Burn them out." Silas commanded. "Spill the crucible." Eleanor looked up in horror. Above them, a massive hanging cauldron of molten iron was moving along the track. The operator, held at gunpoint by one of Silas's men, was tilting the ladle. "Move!" Julian tackled Eleanor. They rolled away just as the cauldron tipped. Tons of liquid fire splashed onto the spot where they had been standing. The iron hit the wet floor, exploding into superheated steam and deadly shrapnel. The heat was instantaneous and unbearable. The molten iron flowed like lava, cutting off their path to the exit. It ignited the coal dust in the air. Flames erupted along the walls. The fire had arrived. "Up!" Julian pointed to a maintenance ladder leading to the crane tracks. "We have to go up." They scrambled up the ladder as the floor below turned into a lake of fire. The wooden pallets, the coal piles, the oil drums, everything was catching fire. The air turned thick with black, choking smoke. Silas watched them climb. "Don't let them reach the roof." His men fired again. A bullet grazed Julian's arm, spinning him around. He nearly fell, hanging by one hand from the rungs. "Julian!" Eleanor grabbed his wrist, heaving him up with a strength born of pure adrenaline. They reached the gantry level. The heat rising from below was cooking them alive. Silas stood at the other end of the narrow metal walkway. He blocked the path to the roof access. He held a revolver in one hand and his silver cane in the other. "Give me the index," Silas demanded, aiming the gun at Eleanor. Behind him, the factory was turning into an inferno. The structural beams were groaning, twisting in the heat. "You'll burn with us," Eleanor shouted, holding the brass cylinder over the railing, dangling it above the molten lake below. "Let us pass, or I'll drop it, and your secrets melt with us." Silas hesitated. The index was made of paper. If it fell into the iron, it was gone forever. "You won't," Silas smiled grimly. "You want justice too much." "I don't want justice anymore," Eleanor said, her eyes reflecting the flames. "I want to see you lose." She let go. Silas screamed. "No!" He lunged for the railing, diving to catch the cylinder. It was a feint. Eleanor hadn't dropped the cylinder. She had dropped the heavy brass cap. The index was still tucked safely in her bodice. But Silas, blinded by greed and panic, had overextended. He leaned too far over the railing. At that moment, a massive explosion rocked the foundry. An oil tank below had ruptured. The shockwave hit the gantry. The railing, weakened by the heat and the blast, gave way. Silas Blackwood flailed, his hand grasping at the empty air. His eyes locked with Eleanor's for 1 second, wide with disbelief. Then he fell. He plummeted 50 feet into the glowing orange river of molten iron below. There was no scream. Just a puff of black smoke as the man who thought he was the architect of the world was unmade by the very fire his family had forged. Eleanor stared down, stunned. "Eleanor!" "The roof!" Julian grabbed her, pulling her away from the edge. The gantry was collapsing. The supports were melting. They ran toward the roof access door, the metal walkway swaying violently under their feet. They burst through the door onto the roof of the foundry. The cool night air hit them, but the roof was not safe. The fire was eating through the building from the inside out. The tar paper beneath their feet was bubbling. "We have to jump," Julian yelled, running to the edge. Below them flowed the Delaware River. It was a 60-foot drop into black, icy water. "I can't." Eleanor looked down. The height was dizzying. "The building is collapsing." Julian shouted. The roof behind them caved in with a thunderous crash, sending a pillar of fire into the sky. Together, Julian took her hand. On 3. 1. The bricks crumbled under their heels. 2. The heat scorched their backs. 3. They leaped. For a second, they were flying, suspended between the fire of the hell they had escaped and the fury of the cold, dark water waiting to claim them. Splash. They hit the water hard. The impact knocked the wind out of Eleanor. The cold was a shock to her system, seizing her muscles. She sank into the darkness. The index, she thought, panic rising. Don't lose the index. She kicked toward the surface, her lungs burning. She broke the water, gasping. The current was strong, dragging her downstream. "Julian!" she screamed. "Here!" He was a few yards away, treading water. He swam to her, grabbing her collar to keep her afloat. They drifted away from the foundry. Behind them, the Blackwood Ironworks was a pyre. The flames reached hundreds of feet into the air, illuminating the river in a ghostly orange glow. The collapse of the dynasty was complete, consumed by its own creation. They washed ashore a mile downstream, collapsing onto the muddy bank of a timber yard. They lay there for a long time, coughing up river water, watching the distant glow of the fire. Eleanor reached into her dress. She pulled out the roll of vellum. It was damp on the edges, but the wax seal of the brass cylinder, which she had kept the paper in before dropping the cap, had protected the core. "We have it," she whispered, her voice rasping. "We have the key." Julian rolled onto his back, staring up at the smoke-filled sky. He started to laugh. It was a manic, exhausted laugh. "He's gone," Julian said. "The architect is gone." "But the oath remains," Eleanor said, sitting up. She looked at the lights of the city. Silas was just the leader. The people in the book, the judges, the senators, they are still there. They will be waking up tomorrow thinking they are safe. She looked at Julian. "We have work to do, Mr. Thorne." Julian sat up. He wiped the water from his face. The journalist was back. "The morning edition goes to press in 4 hours," he said. "If we can get to the Inquirer offices, can we trust them?" "We don't trust the editors," Julian said. "We trust the typesetters, the working men. We print it ourselves." Eleanor stood up. She was shivering, battered, and exhausted. but she felt unbreakable. "Then let's go," she said. "Let's burn the rest of them down." The basement of the Philadelphia Inquirer building smelled of hot lead, oil, and coffee that had been burnt hours ago. It was a subterranean world, far removed from the elegant ballrooms of the Union League or the fiery hell of the ironworks. Here, the rhythm of the city was dictated by the rhythmic clack-clack hiss of the linotype machines. Eleanor Vance sat at a cluttered desk in the corner of the layout room. Her wet clothes had dried into stiff, uncomfortable ridges against her skin, and she shivering uncontrollably. But her hands, stained with river mud and ink, were steady. On the desk before her lay two objects. First, the index, the roll of vellum they had retrieved from the foundry, now flattened out under a heavy paperweight. It was a grid of numbers and symbols, a cipher key designed to unlock a century of secrets. Second, the ledger. "I still don't know how you did it," Eleanor murmured, dipping a pen into an inkwell. Julian Thorne was pacing behind her, smoking a cigarette he had bummed from a typesetter. He looked exhausted, his face gaunt, but his eyes burned with a manic energy. "The chandelier," Julian said, blowing smoke toward the ceiling. "When it crashed onto the dais, Silas dove right. The book flew left. In the dust cloud, I didn't just grab your hand, Eleanor. I grabbed the book. It was instinct. A thief's instinct." "A hero's instinct," Eleanor corrected without looking up. "Let's not go that far," Julian muttered. "Are you making sense of it?" "It's a substitution cipher," Eleanor said, her eyes scanning the columns. "Complex but static. The number 88 isn't a payment amount. It corresponds to the 88th entry in the index." She traced the line with her finger. "Entry 88, she whispered. "November 14th, 1896. Payment for the surveyor's silence." She paused. That was the date her father died. She looked at the name next to the code. In the original ledger, it was just listed as target. But the index gave the name of the man who ordered it. Commissioner O'Banion. Eleanor let out a shaky breath. The police commissioner. The man standing next to Silas at the gala. He ordered my father's death. "Keep going," Julian urged, leaning over her shoulder. "Who else?" Eleanor worked faster now, the pen scratching violently against the paper. "Judge Harrison. He dismissed the charges against the Blackwood factories for using child labor. Mayor Ashcroft. He approved the zoning for the illegal shipyards. Senator Corcoran. He blocked the federal investigation into the smuggling ring." The list went on. It wasn't just a criminal gang. It was the entire infrastructure of the city. The mask of respectability that Philadelphia wore was rotten underneath. These were the men who sat in church pews on Sundays, who cut ribbons at charity events, who lectured the poor on morality. And they were all on the Blackwood payroll. "This is it," Julian said, his voice low. "This is the story of the century. It brings down the government. It brings down the courts." He turned to the man standing by the printing press. Thomas, a burly typesetter with ink-stained arms and a socialist pin on his suspenders. "Thomas," Julian said, "stop the presses." "We're already printing the morning run, Julian," Thomas said, wiping his hands on a rag. "The editor will skin me alive if I stop the headlines about the foundry fire." "Forget the fire," Julian said, slamming his hand onto the desk. "The fire is the symptom. This is the disease." He handed Thomas the sheet of paper Eleanor had been writing on. "Change the front page," Julian ordered. Headline: "The Shadow Cabinet Exposed." Subhead: "The Blackwood Ledger Reveals a City Built on Treason." Thomas read the list of names. His eyes went wide. He whistled low. "You have proof for this?" Thomas asked. "If we print this, the police will be here in 10 minutes. They'll burn the building down." "We have the ledger," Eleanor said, standing up. She held the black book like a shield. "Let them come. But print the papers first. Once the newsboys take them to the streets, they can't kill the truth." Thomas looked at Eleanor, then at Julian. He grinned, a slow, dangerous smile. "I never liked the mayor anyway," Thomas said. He turned to the other men in the room. "Boys, scrap the plates. We have a new lead story. Move it." The room exploded into action. The old lead plates were ripped from the drums. The new type was set with frantic speed. 30. Eleanor watched as the letters were slotted into place. The names of her father's killers were being turned into lead, ready to be stamped onto paper and spread across the world. "It's happening," she whispered. Julian stood beside her. He took her hand. His fingers were cold, but his grip was solid. "The mask falls," he said. Philadelphia Streets, November 17, 1899. Dawn, 6 a.m. The sun rose over a city that was about to change forever. The first batch of papers hit the loading dock at 5:45 a.m. The newsboys, shivering in their caps, grabbed the bundles. They didn't know they were carrying dynamite. "Read all about it," a boy screamed on Market Street. "Blackwood's secrets exposed. Commissioner named in murder plot." The cry went up like a signal fire. At the Union League, where many of the guests from the gala were still recovering or sleeping off the shock of the explosion, the paper arrived with the morning coffee. Senator Corcoran sat in the reading room, nursing a headache. He snapped the paper open. His face went gray. The china cup rattled in his saucer and crashed to the floor. "My God," he whispered. At the police precinct, Commissioner O'Banion walked into his office. His sergeant was standing there, holding the Inquirer. The sergeant didn't salute. He looked at the commissioner with a look of pure disgust. "Sir," the sergeant said, tossing the paper onto the desk. "Is this true?" O'Banion looked at the headline. He looked at the details. The date of the surveyor's death. The amount paid. He didn't answer. He turned, walked into his office, and locked the door. A single gunshot rang out moments later. The Inquirer building, 7 a.m. The police arrived at the newspaper building at 7 a.m. Not the beat cops, but a mounted unit sent by the panicked mayor. "Open up," the captain shouted, banging on the steel doors of the loading bay. "By order of the mayor, this press is shut down." Inside, the presses were silent. The run was finished. 50,000 copies were already circulating in the city. Thomas opened the small wicket gate in the door. He looked at the captain. "You're too late, Captain," Thomas laughed. "The birds have flown." "Where are they?" the captain roared. "Where are Thorne and the girl?" "Gone," Thomas said. "Taking the express to New York. Or maybe Washington. You can't stop the signal, Captain. Everyone knows." He slammed the wicket shut. Eleanor and Julian sat on a bench at the far end of the platform, hidden by the steam of the idling locomotive. They were clean now. They had used the last of their money to buy cheap, ready-made clothes from a market stall. Eleanor wore a simple gray traveling dress. Julian wore a plain brown suit. They watched the passengers reading the paper. They watched the shock on the faces of businessmen and laborers alike. They watched the city waking up to a new reality. A reality where the untouchable gods of industry were suddenly very human and very guilty. "We did it," Eleanor said softly. She felt light, as if a great weight had been lifted from her chest. The ghost of her father was silent at last. "The city is in chaos," Julian noted, watching a group of men arguing heatedly over the paper. "The governor is already calling for a special prosecutor. The Blackwood estate will be seized." He turned to Eleanor. "And you? What now, Miss Vance?" "The library is waiting." Eleanor looked at her hands. The hands that had restored old manuscripts. The hands that had fired a gun. The hands that had forged an alliance with a rogue journalist. "I can't go back," she said. "The woman who worked in that library doesn't exist anymore." She looked at the train. It was bound for New York. The ledger had names from New York too, she said. And Chicago. And London. The oath was not just in Philadelphia. Julian smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile without a shadow of cynicism behind it. "Are you suggesting a sequel, Miss Vance?" "I'm suggesting that the world is full of masks, Mr. Thorne," Eleanor said, standing up as the conductor called, "All aboard. And I find I have a talent for pulling them off." She extended her hand to him. "Coming?" Julian looked at the train, then at the city he was leaving behind. A city he had helped burn down and rebuild in a single night. He took her hand. "Lead the way, partner." They stepped onto the train together. The steam whistle blew, a long, triumphant shriek that echoed off the station walls. As the train pulled away, Eleanor looked out the window one last time. She saw the ruins of the Blackwood Ironworks in the distance, still smoldering. She saw the dome of City Hall. And she saw a city that was, for the first time in a century, truly awake. The adrenaline that had fueled Eleanor Vance for the last 48 hours did not leave her gracefully. It did not fade like a sunset, it crashed like a wave retreating from the shore, leaving her stranded on the sharp rocks of reality. She sat by the window of the second-class carriage, her forehead pressed against the vibrating glass. The landscape of New Jersey whipped by in a blur of brown fields and gray skies, but she saw none of it. All she could see were the flames of the foundry, the face of Silas Blackwood as he fell, and the ink-stained hands of Thomas the typesetter. Her body was a map of her journey. Her hands were wrapped in makeshift bandages, raw from the river water and the iron grate. Her shoulder ached where she had slammed into the tunnel wall. But it was the hollowness in her chest that frightened her the most. She had won. The story was out. The mask had fallen. So why did she feel like she had lost everything? Across from her, Julian Thorne slept. Or rather, he was in a state of unconsciousness brought on by exhaustion. His head lolled against the seat back, his mouth slightly open. In the harsh light of the midday sun, he looked young and incredibly fragile. The bruise on his jaw from the police baton was blooming into a violent shade of purple. Eleanor looked down at her lap. Sitting there was a copy of the Philadelphia Inquirer, purchased at the Trenton stop by a passenger across the aisle. The headline screamed, "City in Chaos, Blackwood Dynasty Crumbles." She read the subcolumns. Mayor Ashcroft resigns in disgrace. Police commissioner found dead in office. Martial law threatened as citizens storm City Hall. And then a smaller column near the bottom. Inquirer offices raided. 3 arrested for inciting riot, including foreman Thomas Miller. Eleanor closed her eyes, a sharp pang of guilt piercing through her numbness. Thomas. The man who had laughed in the face of the police captain. He was in a cell now, likely being beaten, because she and Julian had needed a printing press. This was the cost. Truth was not a clean, surgical incision. It was a bomb. And the shrapnel hit the innocent just as often as the guilty. Stop reading it. Eleanor opened her eyes. Julian was awake. He hadn't moved, but his eyes were open, watching her. They arrested Thomas, Eleanor whispered. Thomas knew the risks, Julian said, his voice raspy. He sat up, wincing as he shifted his weight. He's a union man, Eleanor. He's been waiting for a fight like this his whole life. Don't rob him of his agency by pitying him. It's not pity, Eleanor said, looking out the window again. It's accounting. I used to balance ledgers, Julian. Debts and credits. We have created a massive debt. We paid in blood, Julian countered softly. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the brass cylinder containing the index. He turned it over in his fingers. Your father. My grandfather. We balanced the books. Did we? Eleanor turned to him. My father is still dead. I have no home. I have no job. I am a fugitive with $3 in my pocket. Is that a victory? Julian didn't answer immediately. He looked around the train car. It was filled with ordinary people, families traveling for Thanksgiving, businessmen discussing steel prices. They had no idea that the 2 disheveled figures in the corner had just toppled the government. Victory isn't about what you gain, Eleanor, Julian said finally. It's about what you stop. Silas was going to expand. The oath was spreading. We stopped the cancer. But yes, the surgery leaves scars. The train whistle blew, a lonely sound that cut through the rattling of the wheels. New York is not a sanctuary, Julian added, his tone shifting to practical matters. Silas is dead, but the people named in that ledger. They have friends. Powerful friends in New York. We can't use our names. I know, Eleanor said. She touched the locket around her neck. Eleanor Vance died in the ice house. New York City, November 17, 1899, evening. New York was a beast of a different breed than Philadelphia. If Philadelphia was old money and brick, New York was new money and steel. It was louder, taller, and indifferent to human suffering. They disembarked at Jersey City and took the ferry across the Hudson. As the skyline of Manhattan loomed out of the mist, Eleanor felt a terrifying sense of insignificance. In Boston, she was a known entity. In Philadelphia, she was a hunter. Here, she was a speck of dust. They found a cheap boarding house in the Lower East Side, a tenement district teeming with immigrants. The landlady, a suspicious woman named Mrs. Russo, demanded payment up front. $2 a week, she grunted. No cooking in the room. No guests. Julian checked his pockets. He pulled out a crumpled dollar bill and a few coins. He looked at Eleanor. They didn't have it. The cost of truth was literal now. They were broke. We need a moment, Julian told the landlady. He pulled Eleanor out onto the stoop. I can find a pawn shop, Julian said, looking at his watch. This watch is silver. It might get us a week. No, Eleanor said. That was your father's. It's just metal, Eleanor. No. Eleanor reached behind her neck. She unclasped the gold locket. The one she had refused to sell at the train station in Fort Washington. The one that held the only picture of her mother. She held it in her hand. It was warm. Eleanor, you don't have to, Julian said gently. Yes, I do, she said. Her voice was steady. The past is an anchor, Julian. I can't swim if I keep holding on to it. She opened the locket one last time. She looked at the tiny, faded tintype of the woman she barely remembered. She memorized the curve of her smile. Then, she pried the photo out with her fingernail and slipped the tiny picture into her pocket. She snapped the empty gold locket shut. There is a jeweler on the corner, she said. Go. Julian took the locket. He looked at her with profound sadness. It shouldn't have to be this way. It's the price of admission, Eleanor said. To our new life. The rooftop, November 17, 1899, midnight. The room was smaller than a prison cell, but it had roof access. Eleanor couldn't sleep. The sounds of the tenement, crying babies, shouting neighbors, the rattle of the elevated train, were too foreign. She climbed out the window onto the flat, tar-papered roof. The city stretched out around her, a canyon of lights. She heard footsteps on the gravel behind her. Julian joined her, handing her a bottle of cheap beer he had bought with the surplus money from the locket. Dinner, he said with a wry smile. Eleanor took a sip. It was bitter, but it washed away the taste of the river. I sent a telegram, Julian said after a long silence. Eleanor stiffened. To whom? To the New York Times, Julian said. Anonymously. I told them where to look for the copy of the ledger we mailed from Philadelphia. Just to be sure the story doesn't die in Pennsylvania. Good, Eleanor said. And Julian hesitated. I checked the wire reports. There's a bounty. On us. On the anarchist couple. $5,000. Wanted for the destruction of the Blackwood Ironworks and the murder of Silas Blackwood. Eleanor laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. Murder? He fell. History is written by the survivors, Eleanor. But the law is written by the rich. To them, we are cop killers and arsonists. He leaned against the parapet, looking out at the Brooklyn Bridge. We can never go back, he said. Not to Boston. Not to your library. You can never be an archivist again. Eleanor looked at her hands. They were no longer the soft hands of a woman who handled paper. They were scared, callous. She thought about the quiet of the Athenaeum, the smell of dust, the safety of silence. She missed it so much it made her chest ache. She mourned the death of her simple life. But then she remembered the feeling of the wind on her face as she jumped from the roof of the foundry. She remembered the fire in her veins when she held the gun in the ballroom. I don't want to be an archivist, Eleanor said softly. Julian turned to look at her. What do you want to be? I want to be the one who writes the history, she said, not the one who files it. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass cylinder, the index. We still have this, she said. The ledger had names from all over the country. Blackwood was just one node in the network. There are others. Julian stared at the cylinder. You want to keep going? Eleanor, look at us. We are broken. We are hunted. We barely have a roof over our heads. We are ghosts, Eleanor corrected him. Ghosts can go where the living cannot. We have the key to their secrets, Julian. If we stop now, everything we lost, my father, your grandfather, Thomas, my locket, it was all for nothing. It becomes a tragedy. She looked him in the eye. But if we keep going, if we hunt them down one by one, then it's not a tragedy. What is it then? Julian asked. It's a revolution, Eleanor said. Julian looked at her for a long time. The wind whipped his hair across his face. He saw the bruise on her cheek, the tiredness in her eyes. But he also saw the steel that had been forged in the foundry fire. He took a drink of the beer and set the bottle down on the ledge. A revolution, he mused. Pay is terrible. Hours are long. High chance of death. But the company is interesting, Eleanor said. Julian smiled. He reached out and covered her hand with his. To the cost of truth, he toasted. To the cost, Eleanor replied. They stood there on the roof, two fugitives in a city of millions, watching the smoke rise from the chimneys. They had lost their names, their homes, and their pasts. They had paid the ultimate price for the truth. But as the first snow of the winter began to fall, dusting the dirty rooftops of New York with pristine white, Eleanor Vance realized something. She wasn't empty anymore. She was free. The story of the shadows of the forgotten oath was over. But the story of Eleanor and Julian had just begun. The snow in New York did not stay white. It fell from the heavens pristine and soft, but the moment it touched the city, it was corrupted. It mixed with the soot from the chimneys, the grime of the factories, and the horse manure on the cobblestones, turning into a gray, freezing sludge. Eleanor Vance stood on the corner of Hester Street, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The wind off the East River was a physical assault, biting through the layers of the second-hand woolen coat she had bought from a rag merchant. She held a bag of roasted chestnuts, their warmth seeping into her frozen palms. It was their Christmas dinner. She watched the crowds pushing through the market. Women haggling over goose prices, children running with sticks, men rushing home with parcels wrapped in brown paper. Everyone had a place to be. Everyone had a home. Eleanor turned and walked away from the warmth of the market, heading toward the shadows of the Bowery. She and Julian had been in New York for 5 weeks. 5 weeks of living in the cracks of the city. 5 weeks of looking over their shoulders every time a policeman walked by. The bounty on the anarchist couple had not been rescinded, it had doubled. The newspapers called them dangerous radicals who had murdered a philanthropist. The truth was a currency that had no value in the winter of 1899. She reached the abandoned coal cellar they called home. It was beneath a defunct bakery, accessible only through a rusted hatch in the alley. It was damp, it smelled of mold, but it was hidden. She knocked 3 times. The pause. Then 2 quick knocks. The hatch opened. Julian's face appeared, pale and unshaven in the gloom. "You're late," he whispered, helping her down the ladder. "I had to dodge a patrol on Canal Street," Eleanor said, dropping to the dirt floor. She handed him the bag of chestnuts. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Thorne." Julian took the bag with a faint smile. "Roasted chestnuts. We dine like kings." He sat on the crate that served as their table. Spread out before him were the index, the ledger, and a map of Manhattan that he had stolen from a library. "Any news?" Eleanor asked, warming her hands over the small kerosene heater. "The wire reports are interesting," Julian said, cracking a chestnut. "The Blackwood estate in Philadelphia is being liquidated. The mansion is gutted. The ironworks are scrap metal. The empire is truly dead." "That should make me happy," Eleanor murmured. "But it just feels empty." "That's because you're looking at the fire, not the ashes," Julian said. He pointed to the map. "I've been tracking the assets. Blackwood had millions in liquid capital. It didn't burn with him. It moved." "Moved where?" "Here." Julian tapped a circle on the map. "Wall Street. A firm called Sterling and Company. They bought the Blackwood debt 3 days after the fire. Do you know who runs Sterling?" Eleanor shook her head. "Cornelius Sterling," Julian said. "He's name number 42 in the ledger. The banker of the oath. Eleanor felt a spark of the old anger ignite in her chest. So nothing changed. The head was cut off, but the body just grew a new one. Exactly, Julian said. Sterling is cleaning up the mess. He's the one paying the bounty hunters. He's trying to bury the ashes before anyone sifts through them. He looked at Eleanor. The candlelight caught the hollows under her eyes, the sharpness of her cheekbones. She looked harder, worn down by the winter and the fear. We can leave, Eleanor, Julian said softly. We have the skills. We could go west. California. Change our names again. Disappear. Eleanor looked at the map. She looked at the name Sterling. If we leave, she said, then the oath survives. It hibernates, and in 20 years, it kills someone else's father. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small revolver she had acquired from a pawn shop trade. It wasn't as nice as the one she had lost in Philadelphia, but it fired. We don't go west, Eleanor said. We go to Wall Street. The city was preparing for the turn of the century. The 19th century was dying, and the 20th was waiting to be born. Fireworks were already popping in the distance uptown. The streets of the financial district, usually deserted at night, echoed with the sounds of distant revelry. But Cornelius Sterling was not celebrating. He was working late in his office on the 4th floor of the Sterling building, overlooking the graveyard of Trinity Church. He was a man of precise habits. He was currently burning documents in his fireplace. Down in the graveyard, hidden behind a large mausoleum, Eleanor and Julian watched the window. He's burning them, Julian whispered, lowering his binoculars. He knows the new century brings new audits. He's purging the Blackwood connection. We need those papers, Eleanor said. If he burns the transfer deeds, we lose the trail to the other associates. The building has guards, Julian noted. Pinkertons in the lobby. A private watchman on the floor. We don't need the lobby, Eleanor said, looking up at the stone facade of the building. We have the fire escape. It's iced over, Eleanor. One slip and you're a stain on the pavement. Then I won't slip, she said simply. They moved through the shadows of the tombstones. It was a macabre setting for a heist, surrounded by the dead of the 1700s, fighting the corruption of the 1800s, to save the 1900s. They reached the alley. The fire escape hung 10 feet above the ground. Julian interlaced his fingers. Up you go. Eleanor stepped into his hands and vaulted up, grabbing the bottom rung. The iron burned her bare fingers with cold. She pulled herself up, her boots scrambling for purchase on the icy metal. She lowered the ladder for Julian. They climbed in silence. The wind whipped around the buildings, howling like a banshee. Below them, the city was a grid of gaslights and electric bulbs, a mesmerizing, indifferent beast. They reached the 4th floor. Through the window, they could see Sterling. He was a portly man with matanchop whiskers, frantically throwing bundles of paper into the hearth. He's destroying the evidence, Julian hissed. We have to go in now. Julian took out a glass cutter, a diamond-tip tool he had borrowed from a glazier. He scored a circle in the glass near the latch. He tapped it. The glass fell inward onto the carpet with a muffled thud. He reached in and unlocked the window. They burst into the room. Sterling spun around, dropping a ledger into the fire. Who are you? Guards. Julian didn't hesitate. He tackled Sterling, slamming him into his mahogany desk. The man wheezed, the wind knocked out of him. We know exactly who you are, number 42, Julian growled, pressing his forearm against Sterling's throat. Eleanor didn't look at the men. She ran straight to the fireplace. The ledger was sitting atop the logs, the edges already curling and blackening. She grabbed the fireplace poker and hooked the book, flinging it onto the Persian rug. She stomped on it frantically, extinguishing the flames. You're mad. Sterling gasped, struggling under Julian's grip. Do you know who I am? Eleanor picked up the singed book. It was hot, and the cover was ruined, but the pages inside were intact. She quickly scanned them. It wasn't just transfer deeds. It was a list of names. New names. Senators in Washington. Rail tycoons in Chicago. The ashes, Eleanor whispered. This isn't just the cleanup. This is the seed money for the expansion. She looked at Sterling. You aren't burying the oath. You're franchising it. The oath is necessary. Sterling spat, his face turning red. Order requires funding. Do you think democracy pays for the railroads? For the factories? Men like Blackwood built this country. And men like us are going to tear it down, Julian said. Suddenly, the door to the office burst open. Mr. Sterling? A guard stood there, hand on his holster. Shoot them! Sterling screamed. Eleanor reacted instantly. She grabbed a heavy crystal decanter of brandy from the sidebar and threw it, not at the guard, but at the fireplace. The high-proof alcohol hit the roaring logs. Whoosh! A fireball erupted into the room, blowing smoke and heat outward. The guard flinched, shielding his eyes. The room filled with thick, acrid smoke. Window! Eleanor shouted. Julian released Sterling and grabbed the singed ledger. They dove for the open window. Stop them! The guard fired blindly into the smoke. A bullet shattered the lamp on the desk. Eleanor and Julian scrambled out onto the icy fire escape. They didn't climb down, it was too slow. The roof! Julian pointed up. Cross to the next building. They climbed up to the roof as the alarm bells began to ring below. They ran across the icy tar paper. The gap between the Sterling building and the adjacent bank was 5 feet. A deadly drop into the alley below. Happy New Year, Eleanor. Julian yelled. I hate you, she screamed and jumped. They cleared the gap, landing hard on the neighboring roof, rolling in the snow. They lay there for a second, gasping for air, clutching the salvaged book. Below them, on the street, people were shouting. But they weren't shouting about the robbery. Dun, dun. The bells of Trinity Church began to toll. Midnight. Fireworks exploded over the harbor, painting the sky in red, white, and blue. The city erupted in cheers. Horns blew. People sang Auld Lang Syne. Eleanor sat up in the snow. She looked at the fireworks reflecting in Julian's eyes. She looked at the book in his hands, the evidence that would fuel their fight for the next year, maybe the next decade. The old world, the world of 1899, the world of her father, the world of Blackwood, was gone. It had turned to ash in that fireplace. We made it, Julian whispered, watching the rockets flare. Welcome to the 20th century, Eleanor. Eleanor stood up, brushing the soot from her coat. She looked at the skyline. It looks different now. Sharper, colder, but full of possibility. The old world burned, she said, touching the singed cover of the ledger. Now we see what rises from the ashes. She offered a hand to Julian. Let's go, she said. We have a lot of work to do. They turned and vanished into the shadows of the rooftops, two silhouettes against the exploding sky, ready to carry their war into the new dawn. The 20th century did not feel different in the way a room feels different when you paint the walls. It felt different in the way the air changes before a thunderstorm. It was heavier, faster, and charged with an electric potential that made the hair on Eleanor's arms stand up. Eleanor Vance sat in the observation car of the westbound train. The velvet seat was plush, a luxury they could now afford thanks to a donation Julian had lifted from Sterling's office safe along with the ledger. Outside the panoramic window, the American landscape unspooled like a ribbon of white and gray. Snow-covered fields gave way to smoking steel mills, which gave way to dense, dark forests. She held a cup of tea, the china rattling softly against the saucer with the rhythm of the rails. Clack-clack, clack-clack. It was the heartbeat of the new era. You're analyzing the horizon again, a voice said. Julian slid into the seat opposite her. He looked different. He had shaved the beard he'd grown in the tenements, revealing the sharp jawline of the man she had met on that first train ride out of Boston. He wore a crisp new suit, but his eyes still held the wariness of a fugitive. I'm not analyzing it, Eleanor said, turning from the window. I'm mapping it. And what does the map say? It says the world is very large, Julian, and we are very small. Julian placed a black leather satchel on the table between them. It contained the Sterling ledger, the ashes they had pulled from the fire. Small, perhaps, Julian said, tapping the bag. But dangerous. I've been decoding the Chicago entries. It's worse than Philadelphia, Eleanor. The meatpacking district, the rail unions, the grain exchange. The oath has its tendrils in everything. Eleanor looked at the bag. A month ago, that knowledge would have terrified her. It would have sent her running back to the safety of her dusty books. Now, it just felt like a to-do list. We can't burn it all down, Eleanor said pragmatically. If we destroy the grain exchange, people starve. If we break the railroads, the country stops. So, what is the strategy, Miss Vance? Julian asked, leaning forward. We are no longer reacting. We are hunting. How does the archivist hunt a continent? Eleanor took a sip of tea. She thought about her father. Samuel Vance had believed in boundaries. He believed that if you drew a line on a map, the world would obey it. But he was wrong. The Blackwoods and the Sterlings of the world didn't care about lines. They flowed like water, or like poison, wherever there was a weakness. We don't destroy the system, Eleanor said. We curate it. We perform surgery. We use the index to find the rot, and we cut it out, one tumor at a time. We expose the men, not the institutions. She looked at Julian. We become the editors of history before the ink dries. Julian smiled. Editors with revolvers. I like it. The train slowed, hissing steam as it pulled into a small depot in Ohio to take on water and coal. 10 minutes, the conductor shouted. Eleanor and Julian stepped out onto the platform to stretch their legs. The air was crisp and smelled of coal smoke and winter wheat. A newsstand boy was hawking papers near the entrance. New York papers. Get your New York papers. Sterling Bank scandal. Police baffled by phantom thieves. Julian bought a copy and handed it to Eleanor. They stood under the awning, reading the fallout of their New Year's Eve heist. Cornelius Sterling had not been arrested yet, but the panic was evident. The article described a mysterious duo who had vanished into the night. It speculated on their motives. Were they foreign spies? Anarchists? Robin Hoods? They don't know what to call us, Julian noted. Good, Eleanor said. Names are chains. If they name us, they can catch us. As she folded the paper, she noticed a man watching them from the other end of the platform. He was wearing a bowler hat and a long coat. He wasn't looking at the train, he was looking at them. Eleanor stiffened. She nudged Julian's arm. 3 o'clock, she whispered. Gray coat. Julian didn't turn immediately. He lit a cigarette, using the flame to shield his glance. Pinkerton, Eleanor asked. No, Julian murmured. Too sloppy. He's standing in the light. Freelancer. Maybe a bounty hunter who recognized the descriptions from the wire. The man took a step toward them. His hand moved toward his coat pocket. Eleanor didn't panic. She didn't run. She simply shifted her stance, moving her hand into her muff where her revolver was concealed. She looked directly at the man. She locked eyes with him. It was a look of absolute, terrifying calm. It was the look of a woman who had survived the ice house, the foundry, and the Lions Denver. It said, "Do you really want to die for $50 in a train station in Ohio?" The man paused. He saw the cold steel in her eyes. He saw the way Julian had subtly shifted his weight, ready to strike. The bounty hunter hesitated. He looked at the train, then back at them. He tipped his hat nervously, turned around, and walked away into the town. Julian exhaled a cloud of smoke. He decided he wanted to live to see 1901. Wise choice, Eleanor said. The conductor called, "All aboard." They climbed back onto the train. As it lurched forward, leaving the station behind, Eleanor realized that the fear was truly gone. She wasn't the prey anymore. She was the predator. The sun began to set over the plains, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. The new horizon was bleeding into the night. Eleanor and Julian sat in the dining car now. They had ordered wine. "To Samuel," Julian said, raising his glass. "And to Arthur." "To the forgotten," Eleanor replied, clinking her glass against his. They drank. "You know," Julian said, looking at the wine, "we never really talked about what happens after." "After what?" "After we finish the list. After we run out of names in the ledger." What happens to us? Eleanor looked at him. She saw the question behind the question. They were bound by trauma and adrenaline. But what were they without a war to fight? The list is long, Julian, she said softly. It will take years. And after the years? Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand. Her skin against his was warm. Then we find a new story, she said. Or maybe we finally rest. She looked out at the darkening horizon. But not yet. Julian squeezed her hand. No, not yet. He opened the satchel and pulled out the ledger again. He opened it to the page marked Chicago. So, he said, the old spark returning to his eyes. Where do we start? The meatpackers or the rail barons? Eleanor smiled. It was a sharp, dangerous smile. The rail barons, she said. I've always hated a late train. The locomotive whistled, a long, defiant scream into the night. The train picked up speed, rushing headlong into the darkness, carrying the two guardians of the truth toward a future that was unwritten, uncertain, and entirely their own. The shadows of the forgotten oath had been dispersed by the light. But where there is light, there are always new shadows. And Eleanor Vance and Julian Thorne would be there to find them.